I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction. So please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story in all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter. And if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 551. Those who fawn upon their superiors will inevitably be arrogant towards their inferiors. The mutiny at the front lines occurred 2 days prior, on the third day of Nivelle's offensive. Perhaps emboldened by the victory on the first day, Nivelle ordered his soldiers to continuously charge the enemy lines, even at night. He believed commanding the battle was easy. It was simply a matter of bringing in troops from elsewhere and pushing them onto the battlefield. As for whether soldiers fell in droves to enemy fire, he considered that a natural occurrence on the battlefield. However, the subsequent offensive did not go smoothly. The Germans applied the reverse slope fortifications of Charles to the Somme campaign, utilizing every high ground, even small hills. Landmines were laid between the high ground, including directional mines. This rendered the Anglo-French artillery superiority ineffective, tanks instantly became useless, and the defensive lines once again reached a stalemate. The image above is a real shot of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army's reverse slope position. The ridge line is the boundary between the forward and reverse slopes. Tunnels were usually set up near this location, where about a squad of soldiers would hide and prepare to throw grenades. The ridge line's position was crucial. Grenades could be thrown directly from the reverse slope onto the forward slope to kill the enemy. Reconnaissance soldiers would also observe the enemy from the ridge line and report enemy movements using flag signals. Even so, eager for further victory and to prove himself, Nivelle still ordered his soldiers to attack, wave after wave. At some point, when the officer blew the whistle to give the order to attack, some soldiers no longer shouted and charged at the enemy with bayonets. Instead, they bleated and slowly approached the enemy. This was a protest against the order, a sign that they were poor lambs being sent to the slaughterhouse. Some even carried their rifles on their shoulders, their hands on their heads in a ram's horn shape. Since they were going to die anyway, what difference did it make whether they had a rifle or not? The officers couldn't blame the soldiers, because they were following orders to charge, and besides, these disgruntled guys would likely die on the battlefield and never return, so they let them be. However, what the officers hadn't anticipated was how quickly the situation deteriorated. This method soon spread throughout the entire army, to the point that every charge was met with a chorus of bleating. It was no longer a mournful cry, but a way for soldiers to communicate and unite. Bleating like sheep meant they were on the same side, opposed to the pointless charge. Otherwise, they were the enemy. They hadn't known how powerful they were before, now they did. Almost everyone was against it, including the junior officers. Any officer who objected was immediately isolated, and their orders were ignored. After a night of build-up, by the next morning the soldiers were ignoring the officers' orders to attack. They shouted at the officers, "We refuse a pointless charge. Our lives aren't meant to waste German bullets, we want peace. To hell with this war, if we're to attack, let the commander-in-chief lead us." The troops were completely out of control. Many soldiers got drunk and went to sleep, ignoring the officers' shouts and urging like statues. Even more alarming, this phenomenon was spreading from the Somme to the entire defensive line. Christine, who was highly respected in the 1st Special Artillery Division for his compassion for his subordinates, was also affected and unable to effectively command his troops. Sensing the dire situation, he could only send a telegram to Charles for help. Bourbon Palace, House of Representatives. Under the questioning gazes of the crowd, Nivelle struggled to remain calm. He replied expressionlessly, "Things aren't as bad as you make them out to be, Major General. I've handled it properly." "Mind your own business, I know how to handle mine." "Is that so?" Charles interrupted Nivelle. "Your so-called proper handling means executing a group of mutinous representatives and then forcing troops into the battlefield." Nivelle was accustomed to flattering superiors, not subordinates. The saying goes, "He who flatters his superiors will be arrogant to his subordinates." The more subservient he was to Parliament and the British, the more arrogant he would be towards the soldiers on the front lines. Therefore, he didn't hesitate to use harsh methods to suppress them. Nivelle hadn't grasped the situation. The soldiers knew they were doomed. Why would they fear execution and suppression? This would only worsen the situation. Charles turned to the counselors, raising his voice. The commander-in-chief didn't tell you that at least 10 divisions on the front lines have refused to fight, and their numbers are growing. We should consider ourselves lucky. The Germans have profited handsomely from their defense, making them more willing to remain on the defensive. Otherwise, you know what would have happened. The meeting room erupted in chaos. The counselors paled, whispering amongst themselves, a large-scale mutiny? 10 divisions refusing to fight? If the Germans counterattack now, the Western Front will collapse completely, and the Germans might once again reach Paris. No, André, you're still thinking about Paris? Then France will only have one option: surrender. Yes, we will lose all our fighting soldiers and will never be able to organize a force capable of stopping the Germans. Galleri peeked out from behind, his face filled with terror and his voice trembling with fear. Is it true? But we haven't received any news. Nibbler tried to deny it. Charles stared intently at him, shaking his head to stop him. It's no use, Commander-in-Chief. They can easily find out the truth. Nibbler paused, then sighed. Charles was right. Galleri was the Minister of War, and there were also members of Parliament and government officials. They had hundreds of ways to investigate. It was impossible to hide the truth. It's true, Nibbler replied with difficulty, but the situation isn't as bad as it seems. Is it worse than this? Gallieni's eyes blazed with anger. 10 divisions are already gone. Even if you can control it now, it's an unprecedented tragedy. A member of Parliament yelled at Nibbler, "You liar, murderer. Making you commander-in-chief was a mistake. We've had enough. You have to take responsibility." Nibbler was still trying to defend himself. I had no choice. I couldn't let this get out. But Nibbler's explanations were weak and ineffective. Everyone knew that if he truly valued this mutiny, he should at least be on the front lines, not slandering Charles in Parliament. The meeting room fell silent. Everyone looked at Nibbler with mockery, sorrow, and pity, but no anger, as if watching a joke. Nibbler's face turned pale. At that moment, he realized his political career had come to an end. Chapter 552. Speaking the truth. The French troops on the Somme front, caught in a rare winter drizzle, were detached from worldly troubles, far removed from their anxieties. A light rain fell from the sky, the air thick with the stench of rotting corpses, the ground puddled with murky water, and the occasional whistling shell would fly overhead, its explosion sending up waves of muddy water. Yet, the soldiers entertained themselves in their trenches. Some slept soundly in their tunnels, others carved wooden blocks with bayonets under their cloaks, and still others carefully shaved in front of a small, broken mirror, their helmets turned upside down to catch the rain. The image above shows a whippet tank carved from hardwood by French soldiers during World War I. Creating trench art from hardwood, shell casings, and other materials was a common pastime for soldiers. They could even exchange these artworks for cigarettes with their comrades. Captain Jeremy and several men were playing cards under the cover of raincoats. They called it their last bit of fun, because the cards would soon turn to mush from the moisture, and they had to play as many rounds as possible before that happened. They were careful, using 2 raincoats overhead and a moisture-proof sheet on the table. At this rate, we could probably play all day, Captain Jeremy said optimistically. But before he could finish speaking, the clumsy orderly Leo dropped 2 cards while shuffling, instantly making them dirty and wet with water and mud. This drew a chorus of complaints from the soldiers. You should bleat like a sheep more often, Leo. You're even worse than those officers who herd us into battle. Well, another boring day ahead. Leo, picking up the playing cards, suddenly changed his expression and, staring at the other end of the trench, called out softly, "Look there, the sheep herders are coming." The soldiers likened themselves to sheep and the senior officers who ordered them to charge to sheep herders. Several men paused, turning to follow Leo's gaze. Sure enough, they saw several officers, protected by guards, slowly and politely wading through the puddles. The leader was thin, and his face and rank were obscured by his raincoat. Only a top cap was visible. Captain Jeremiah snorted, "Ignore them. If all the sheep are disobedient, the sheepherders will have nothing to do." The soldiers chuckled softly, a hint of smugness in their voices. Leo carefully wiped the stains off the playing cards with a towel, fanning himself with it. "Let them air out a bit, maybe we can continue." They expected the officer to walk by, but instead, he stopped beside them and asked, "What are you playing?" "Count me in." Everyone froze. This wasn't what they expected. They thought the officer would yell at them to go to their fighting positions or grab their rifles and attack. "We're playing Barbu, sir," Leo replied. But he was glared at by Captain Jeremiah, They shouldn't speak to their superior so easily. Leo shrank back, not daring to say anything more. All right, the officer lifted the raincoat over his cap slightly. It seems I'm not welcome here, Captain Jeremiah replied without thinking. Indeed, sir. He froze, staring blankly at the officer, before finally reacting. Charles? You're Charles? The nearby soldiers stopped what they were doing and turned to look at them in shock. Charles nodded, glanced around, and asked, Gentlemen, is everything all right? If it were anyone else, the soldiers would have taken it as sarcasm. How could things be all right here? They might even have beaten up the officer who asked and sent him back, or made him stay and experience life with them for a few days. However, since it was Charles asking, they felt it was only natural, even somewhat warm. Everyone present had received some favor from Charles. His company had consistently donated supplies to the front lines and published articles in the Meritorious Service Bulletin explaining tactics and survival skills. In their hearts, Charles represented hope, the hope of winning and surviving. Someone answered, their voice choked with emotion. You've finally come, General. Are you here to command us? We're all fine, General. But immediately someone retorted, No, General, we're not doing well. We need your help. Charles nodded, calmly replying, I know, that's the purpose of my visit. Silence fell, broken only by the patter of raindrops hitting puddles. Jeremiah was initially stunned, unable to believe Charles was right in front of him. After a moment, he snapped out of it, stood up, and shook hands with Charles. General, Jeremiah said, you can consider me their representative. A flicker of surprise crossed Charles's eyes. You're very brave. Mutiny meant execution, regardless of the success of negotiations. Jeremiah smiled slightly. No, General, it won't make a difference. Charles understood his meaning. They wouldn't live much longer anyway. Execution was just another way to die. Then Jeremiah steered the conversation to the point. I respect you. We all respect you, General, but I'm sorry, we can't take up arms again and go back to the battlefield just because of your word. That's not what we want. Charles nodded. Of course. Then he added, tell me, what are your conditions? Even brothers should settle accounts clearly. Now was the time for that. Jeremiah replied, first, we refuse to attack. However, I hope you don't mistake us for slaves and deserters. Defending the position is fine. We just don't want to die meaninglessly under enemy fire. Charles raised an eyebrow, without the slightest hesitation. That's a bit difficult, Captain. War inevitably involves attacks. It's impossible to only defend the position, but I can guarantee that we will try our best to avoid any more meaningless attacks. Jeremiah was taken aback. He hadn't expected Charles to reject his first request. He glanced around with difficulty. More and more soldiers were gathering, including several representatives. Jeremiah decided to discuss the matter with them. With a wink, he signaled to several men to gather at the other end of the trench. I believe Charles's words are credible, and not just because he is Charles. Yes, other officers, to appease us, would certainly agree to all our conditions first, then renege later. He could easily have done that, but he didn't. He accepted our conditions to a limited extent and also stated his bottom line. War cannot be fought with only defense and no offense. This was a decision Charles had made before arriving. He believed that only by telling the truth could he gain the soldiers' trust. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 553 The Last Condition. A while later, Captain Jeremiah and several others returned to Charles. General, Captain Jeremiah said, we hope to have the right to go home and take leave. Charles agreed without hesitation. Of course, he gestured to his staff officer, who took a backup document from his briefcase, shielding it from the rain, and handed it to him. Charles explained, this is our proposed rotation plan. Take a look. Captain Jeremiah took it and flipped through it, his eyes lighting up as he excitedly shouted to those around him, we'll get a week's leave after each rotation. The soldiers erupted in cheers. Previously, the rotations involved rear line garrisoning, third line garrisoning, second line garrisoning, moving layer by layer to the front lines, spending a week there before returning to the front lines again, with no leave whatsoever. Now, with a week's leave after each rotation, it was undoubtedly good news for the soldiers. However, a bearded lieutenant beside Captain Jeremiah remained cautious. He glanced at a plan in Jeremiah's hand and stepped forward to ask Charles, "General, it's not that we don't trust you, but has the council approved this rotation plan?" The soldiers all turned their attention to Charles. Many things were beyond Charles's control. The decision rested with the council. They worried that Charles might agree to one thing, but the council might make another. Before Charles could speak, the staff officer interjected, "It has been approved by the council, otherwise, the general would have arrived yesterday. The reason you only arrived today is because the general was advocating for your interests in the council. You know, those people in the council are not easy to deal with." The staff officer's answer was timely. These words were not suitable for Charles to say himself, as they would seem self-aggrandizing. It was much more effective for the staff officer to say them. Sure enough, the soldiers' gazes towards Charles held even more gratitude and respect. However, the bearded veteran still had concerns. He asked again, "As we all know, we couldn't get leave before because of a shortage of manpower. The manpower problem still exists, and allowing us leave will inevitably strain our forces. General, how do you plan to solve this problem?" Captain Jeremiah nodded slightly in agreement. If the root cause wasn't addressed, the government and parliament solutions would be meaningless. Charles calmly replied, "The manpower problem is easily solved. We will maintain a strategic defensive posture for a period of time. We all know that defense requires far fewer troops than offense. Furthermore, we return to your first request. We will try to avoid meaningless attacks, which will also conserve manpower." The bearded veteran considered for a moment, then nodded slightly, indicating that this was indeed feasible. Then Charles laughed. "You're worried that I've also been deceived by the parliament, aren't you?" Many soldiers nodded, including Captain Jeremiah and several other representatives. It wasn't that they didn't trust Charles, but rather that they worried he too had been kept in the dark and used as a shield by the parliament. Charles spoke casually, "I'm not sure if the council will renege on its promises later, but I'm on your side, and I will do everything in my power to ensure these commitments are fulfilled. On the other hand, I think you should realize that this approach is dangerous. I'm not talking about councillors, nobles, or capitalists. We don't care about their danger," Charles added jokingly. "I almost forgot, I'm a capitalist too." The soldiers laughed. Charles wasn't an ordinary capitalist. They were willing to fight for him and protect him. Charles moved closer, naturally walking into the crowd. This was unthinkable for the other officers, a high-ranking officer walking into a mutinous horde of soldiers. He could be killed by the angry soldiers. Something similar had happened before. The soldiers hadn't drawn their guns, but they had thrown stones at officers who came shouting, and the officers were eventually dragged away by guards, bleeding from the head. Charles believed he didn't need to worry about that. He had cultivated a good reputation and used his wealth. Now, it was time for that reputation to come into play. "We also have families to protect," Charles said calmly and evenly. "Think about the situation now, gentlemen. What if the Germans attack now? Can you hold them off? What will happen to your families if the lines collapse? Including yourselves." The soldiers exchanged glances. They knew Charles was right. Although the mutiny slogan was "Agree to garrison, oppose attack," the disorganized mutiny was uncontrollable, and the troops had lost their fighting capacity. Some soldiers drove armored reconnaissance vehicles into ammunition depots, taking whatever equipment and ammunition they wanted. Some soldiers left the trenches and hid in the forest, believing it to be safer and more suitable for defense. Others occupied nearby towns and declared independence, establishing a so-called new government. Could such an army hold off the German attack? They'd probably scatter and flee the moment the Germans arrived. Captain Jeremiah's expression was grave, his eyes filled with worry. "That's what we're worried about too, General. If the line collapses, our families will be the first to be in danger, while capitalists, members of parliament, and nobles will flee beforehand. That's why we're still here." They had held their ground, refusing to leave, despite the unbearable conditions and the possibility of an enemy counterattack. "I know," Charles nodded in reply. "You are the bravest and most loyal men. Your courage is unmatched." This was the truth. Few could remain at their posts even during a mutiny. But that's not enough, far from enough. Charles's gaze swept across the entire assembly. "What we need is an army that can hold the line, an army that can protect our families in France." "Can you do that?" Captain Jeremy stepped forward. "We can, General. We are willing to obey your command." One soldier after another stepped forward. "We can. We believe in you, General. Lead us into battle." The bearded man stepped forward, blocking the others. One last condition, General, Charles grunted, listening attentively. We hope you will become commander-in-chief. The bearded man's eyes were fixed on Charles. Charles was stunned. This was actually a condition? The soldiers responded in unison, yes, let Charles become commander-in-chief, that's the best guarantee, only if he becomes commander-in-chief will we not be lambs to the slaughter. But there was something different in the bearded man's eyes. Could all of Charles's actions be for the sake of becoming commander-in-chief? Chapter 554 Don't you set any standards for yourselves? The bearded man had actually dug a trap for Charles. Among the lower-ranking soldiers and civilians, many harbored deep-seated hatred and distrust of capitalists. They had been exploited by capitalists since childhood, and this resentment hadn't developed overnight. Deeply entrenched in this cycle of oppression, they didn't believe there were any good people among capitalists, not even Charles. They believed everything Charles did was fake, purposeful, and a ploy to use the common people to rise to power, that money and supplies are nothing to capitalists, but they can win them people's support. Charles can indeed achieve victory and develop equipment, but this also brings him huge rewards. All of this is paving the way for his rise to power. Charles is the smartest one, he knows how to control the hearts and minds of the people. Many held this view. The bearded man was one of them, firmly believing Charles had ulterior motives. For example, this time, Charles hoped to replace Nivelle as the commander-in-chief of the French and Allied forces. The bearded man had made up his mind. If Charles readily accepted the invitation to be commander-in-chief, it would reveal his true intentions. This would suggest that Charles was no different from other capitalists, only more adept at concealing his true nature. Therefore, this mutiny shouldn't end, otherwise many would be purged afterward, a matter of life and honor, requiring careful consideration. Note, historically, over 20,000 people were ultimately purged in this mutiny, with most of the leaders executed. Unexpectedly, Charles refused without the slightest hesitation. No, I don't think I should be commander-in-chief. The bearded man was stunned. He hadn't expected Charles to refuse, much less so decisively and resolutely. The other soldiers, lacking the bearded man's cunning, asked anxiously, their voices tinged with disappointment, why, is it because Parliament disagrees? We can fight for you, General. No, gentlemen, Charles replied, you don't understand the position of commander-in-chief. It requires accountability to Parliament and even to the British. The soldiers were stunned. Some nodded, seemingly understanding, whispering among themselves, yes, if Charles becomes commander-in-chief, he will directly face orders from Parliament, and the British, they will still use resources to pressure the commander-in-chief, then Charles will have no freedom or room to maneuver, unlike now where he can seize opportunities to attack the enemy's weaknesses. That makes sense. Once he becomes commander-in-chief, Charles will have to report everything to Parliament, and Parliament will then pass the plans to the Germans. Since the Grevy affair was exposed, everyone knew that Parliament was a mixed bag and unable to keep secrets. This was one of the reasons why Parliament was currently under martial law. Martial law wasn't imposed by Charles, but rather proposed by him and approved by Parliament before being implemented. The members of Parliament knew they were being leaked, and the large-scale mutiny at the front was a serious matter. If the Germans found out, France would be finished. Therefore, considering the bigger picture, the parliamentarians voted to impose martial law. All members of Parliament were forbidden from leaving the Bourbon Palace and from contacting outsiders. The blockade was to be maintained by the guards of War Minister Gallieri. Charles was ordered to go to the Somme to negotiate with the mutinous soldiers. Martial law could not be lifted until the mutiny was resolved. Charles added, furthermore, have you considered that if I become commander-in-chief with your support, Parliament will treat me as an enemy, because today I can use you to force Parliament to become commander-in-chief, and tomorrow I can use you to force Parliament to pass other proposals. What do you think this is? The soldiers looked at each other. They only knew how to support Charles, never realizing they had unknowingly embarked on the path of dictatorship they had always opposed. I won't do that, Charles reiterated. Despite the many wrong decisions made by Parliament, I believe this is precisely the embodiment of French freedom and justice. We should protect this system, not challenge it. What do you think? This was nonsense. Charles knew the true nature of Parliament. It was merely the result of a power struggle among capitalists. The problem was that the French people, under the long-term propaganda of capitalists, had generally accepted the parliamentary system. Charles could only say things that aligned with their expectations. Otherwise, even with his unparalleled prestige, he might be abandoned like Boulanger. This was dangerous. Parliament was adept at using this to seize the moral high ground. Charles's words immediately garnered widespread support from the soldiers. He's a respectable general. He had the potential to become a dictator but didn't. Yes, he voluntarily gave it up. He gave up power, status, and immeasurable benefits. That's the French spirit. He's the commander we truly need, and our hope. The bearded man was stunned. He had considered many answers, even a feigned refusal from Charles, but he never expected Charles to answer like this. Charles's words practically sealed his own fate, because becoming commander-in-chief with a soldier's support meant dictatorship. This completely overturned the bearded man's previous assessment of Charles. Charles might indeed be a pure capitalist and general, fighting for the interests of France and its citizens. Any other questions? Charles gestured around, finally fixing his gaze on the bearded man. No, General, the bearded man replied, at least I don't. Are you sure? Charles stared at the bearded man, then glanced at Captain Jérôme and the other representatives. Don't you want to set some standards for yourselves? The bearded man and Captain Jérôme exchanged glances and gently shook their heads. No, General, Captain Jérôme replied. Thank you very much, General. The bearded man's eyes shone with sincerity. He completely believed everything Charles said. Charles's words, seemingly simple, were quite profound and heavy. Don't you want to set some standards for yourselves? It also meant, you might be purged afterward. You should consider how to protect yourselves. No one would say such a thing except Charles. Any officer who came to negotiate would have assured them, you won't be purged. We'll forget all about it, as long as you reorganize your troops now. Only Charles not only didn't say those things, but actually reminded them. Therefore, he was on the soldiers' side, without a doubt. All right, Charles nodded to the representatives. You are true warriors, warriors who dare to face death. I will do my best to protect you. The bearded man instantly broke down, his eyes reddening as he silently stared at Charles. He had actually been doubting Charles all along. Chapter 555 Luxurious Command Center. On the south bank of the Somme, in Niveler, stood the headquarters of the 6th Army. Located a full 5 kilometers from the front lines, it was a fortified stronghold built of reinforced concrete. The interior was spacious, over 200 square meters, complete with a communications room, operations room, and rest room, housing more than 20 staff officers of the rank of colonel or higher. It also had a basement crammed with supplies, enough for the headquarters staff, including the guards, for several months. Charles, leading Christine, strolled through the headquarters, looking it over incredulously. Christine was equally astonished. Compared to his own headquarters at the front, this place was like paradise. After touring the area, Charles asked Major General Raymond, the Army's deputy commander, do you intend to turn this place into a shelter? No, General, Major General Raymond replied, considering the German 105mm guns have a range of over 10 kilometers, the command post is within that range. Charles interrupted Raymond, then, has a single shell hit this command post? Major General Raymond was somewhat embarrassed. No, General, of course not, Major General Raymond, Charles replied. This fortress is hidden behind the high ground, in a blind spot of enemy fire. Furthermore, it's 5 kilometers from the front line and 6 kilometers from the enemy's defensive line. If the German 105mm guns can reach this point, they will inevitably be within our artillery range. Major General Raymond seemed not to understand Charles's meaning, a hint of smugness on his face. Yes, General, you're right. So it's very safe here, very suitable for you to command without distractions. Charles was speechless. Frontline soldiers, hiding in trenches made of mud and water, endured hunger and cold, and were driven wave after wave into no man's lands by officers, falling victim to enemy machine gun and artillery fire. Meanwhile, high-ranking officers in the rear, sheltered in what could be described as luxurious fortresses, adding layer upon layer of protection, some of which was utterly unnecessary. The same army, yet worlds apart. Major General Raymond, Charles said, the council has appointed me commander of the 6th Army, to handle all affairs here. You've received the telegram, haven't you? Yes, General, Major General Raymond replied, straightening up. We have received it. We obey your command. Very good. Charles sat down in the chair that had previously belonged to Nivelle and said calmly, you have all been dismissed. Return to Paris for investigation. Major General Raymond was taken aback. Me, not just you, Charles corrected. It's all of you. All officers of major rank and above. Major General Raymond was stunned. Recovering, he asked, his tone urgent and angry, "But why? What reason do you have to do this?" "Supplies, Major General," Charles reminded him. "Plus dereliction of duty. Is that enough?" Major General Raymond fell silent instantly. In wartime, when supplies were extremely scarce, everyone's rations were strictly regulated, but the personnel in the command post exceeded the normal range by dozens of times. This alone was enough to convict them. Moreover, Charles believed that many of them had secretly taken supplies home to share with their families. These are military supplies, the rations for the soldiers on the front lines, the foundation upon which they risked their lives to charge the enemy. But Major General Raymond remained unconvinced, arguing, "This is unfair, General. These supplies were obtained by General Neville from the British. They have nothing to do with us. You can leave those words for the military court," Charles said, nodding to the side. The guards understood and disarmed Major General Raymond and the command personnel, taking them away. After Major General Raymond was taken away, Christine asked worriedly, "General, the organization and supplies of the Sixth Army are all in the hands of these men. If we send them all to Paris for trial, won't the subsequent work?" Charles gently shook his head. "Do you know why the soldiers on the front lines mutinied?" Christine asked curiously. "Wasn't it because of the pointless attacks?" Charles stood up and spread his hands around. "That's only one part, General. It's also because of this. The commanders are hiding in the safest rear, eating delicious food and drinking wine, and with just a wave of their hand, they can order the starving and freezing frontline soldiers to charge into the enemy and die. They didn't take up arms and attack this command post. Taking these officers to the execution ground one by one is already quite restrained." Christine nodded to indicate that she understood. Charles wasn't dwelling on the petty greed of Major General Raymond and his group, but rather setting an example for the mutinous soldiers, letting them know that everything would go on a different track, and that the officers would stand with the soldiers, not their enemies. Sure enough, news of Charles dismissing all officers of the rank of colonel and above from the army group headquarters quickly spread throughout the entire army. Not just one or two, but all the officers. All of them were sent to a military court by Charles. It is said that more than 10 tons of flour and hundreds of bottles of wine were found, and they even had their own cooks. Charles is different from other officers. He is always with his soldiers, which is one of the reasons why he always wins battles. This was only the first step. Subsequently, Charles used his personal funds to purchase a batch of raincoats, boots, quilts, and other supplies urgently needed for the rainy season and winter for the front lines, and also transported fresh vegetables and beef to improve the rations. This cost Charles a lot of money. After all, at this time the Sixth Army on the Somme had 13 divisions, about 210,000 men, and providing supplies and food for such a large force was not an easy task. If it were anyone else, they might not have been able to do it at all. Even if they had money, they could not have bought enough supplies in such a short time and would have had to ask the British for help. The reason Charles was able to do it was because his previous arrangements had worked. Djokovic followed Charles's advice and exchanged his earnings for US dollars, avoiding the devaluation of the franc. They also procured large quantities of supplies from the United States and the Netherlands through Effen's branches, barely managing to meet the needs of the Somme. Charles believed this was worthwhile. The high-ranking members of Parliament would never understand the importance of gaining the support of the rank-and-file soldiers. It practically represented the will of the people. Behind every soldier was a family anxiously worrying. And behind every 200,000 soldiers were 200,000 families. At this moment, every act of kindness from Charles was like sending charcoal in snowy weather, at a critical moment when they needed help most, even when facing life and death. They would remember that Charles had pulled them back from the brink of collapse. However, even so, the mutinous soldiers still harbored concerns. The Battle of the Somme was not over. If they obeyed orders and reorganized, would they be sent to their deaths by officers again, just like before? Chapter 556. What's truly terrifying is often not the enemy. After dealing with Major General Raymond, Charles immediately converted the luxurious command post into a field hospital center. It was called a center because the 200-plus square meters was simply insufficient for the seriously wounded. He ordered tents to be erected around the command post, which would serve as an operating room and high-risk ward, providing food, clean drinking water, and bandage cleaning services. Supplies stored in the basement remained unmoved and were used as supplies for the field hospital. No one objected to Charles's arrangement. Treating the wounded well was a fundamental virtue of a commander. Only commanders who only cared about fame and fortune would disregard the lives of the wounded. Besides, the soldiers would all consider that one day they might become wounded soldiers lying in a field hospital awaiting treatment. Any opposition today could backfire. After completing these tasks, Charles returned to the 1st Special Artillery Division command post with Christine. Christine's command post was much more normal, a dark, damp tunnel, kerosene lamps emitting a foul odor, a dozen or so people crammed into the cramped space, the shouts of the communications soldier almost within reach. The only place to sit was on a bed, the table was made of stacked artillery shell boxes, and documents were piled up everywhere in a mess. The situation is improving. Because the tunnel was low, Christine had to crouch down to report. Some soldiers are willing to obey orders, and those who deserted the lines are gradually returning to their units. The initial estimate is about 100,000, Charles grunted in agreement. Of the 210,000 troops, only 100,000 could be counted, and even these 100,000 might not all obey orders. The situation was still far from optimistic. We need to speed things up, Charles frowned slightly. He had never felt a crisis so close before, not even when the German army was at the gates of Paris at the very beginning of the war. When the German army was at the gates of Paris, the French army still had strength and room for maneuver. Now, the French army is facing the Germans head-on on the front lines, in a state of disarray without command. A single German counterattack could wipe out the main French force. Christine frowned, but we've done everything we can. It's just a matter of time. Negotiating with the soldiers, dealing with the arrogant officers, replenishing supplies and improving food and conditions, coupled with Charles's reputation and credibility, had stabilized the situation and brought it to temporary improvement. Now, it seemed all they could do was wait. But Charles shook his head. No, there's still something we can do. What? Christine looked blank, he couldn't think of anything else. Charles looked up at Christine and said, word by word, fight a battle. Christine's eyes widened in surprise. General, they're mutinying because they're afraid of fighting. Many are worried about being sent back to the battlefield to die, and you want to fight a battle now. That might not be appropriate. Charles interrupted Christine. No, Christine, they're not afraid of fighting, nor are they mutinying for that reason. They're afraid of dying meaninglessly. There might be cowards using this as an excuse to desert, but for those people, there's little point in bringing them back. Christine nodded thoughtfully. However, he still thought fighting was too risky. One wrong move could destroy the favorable situation they had just built. Christine didn't realize that Charles's concerns weren't just about the mutiny itself. Charles looked at the map on the table, his gaze shifting to the British war zone on the north bank of the Somme. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing isn't the enemy, but one's own allies. As darkness fell, the British offensive on the north bank of the Somme, separated from the French by only a river, temporarily halted. The lack of a simultaneous French attack from the south bank would arouse suspicion in the Germans. The British situation was also dire. Their offensive over the past 10 days had resulted in nearly 200,000 casualties. The British had never suffered such heavy losses in over a century. The Boer War, lasting 3 years, had only incurred over 40,000 casualties, including those who died of disease and went missing. However, despite the unfavorable situation, Haig remained excited. The French have mutinied, they refuse to fight, a communications officer reported. This was hardly good news, as the French were allies. If the French collapsed entirely, the British would be left without support, and even the Allied powers might collapse as a result. Nivelle has been dismissed. Charles has been appointed commander of the 6th Army, overseeing operations on the Somme. Parliament is urgently electing the next commander-in-chief. This was also bad news, even arguably terrible news, as Charles's strength had increased. Charles's troop strength was originally limited to his 2 divisions, and no one dared to increase his forces, even after promotions. This bastard, with just over 20,000 men in 2 divisions, had already captured hundreds of thousands of German soldiers in Antwerp. Give him more troops, and France would be his domain. This was something Parliament didn't want to see. However, due to the need to stabilize the situation, Parliament had no choice but to appoint Charles as commander of the 6th Army. After all, no one was better suited to stabilizing morale. As a result, Charles's troop strength increased more than tenfold. However, Haig, considering the 2 pieces of information together, realized they were incredibly good news. Charles was in charge of the Somme, and the French army was out of control. If this information were leaked to the Germans at the right time, It couldn't be more perfect. He could use the Germans to weaken both Charles and the French army simultaneously. God had given him a golden opportunity. As long as he controlled a degree and provided appropriate reinforcements to the French army, Charles and the French army would be left to rely on the British, and they would be under his control. Thinking of this, a slight smile unconsciously crept onto Haig's lips. "Blaze," Haig called out, turning his head. "Yes, General," the staff officer, who was organizing documents, responded, jogging over and standing before Haig. "It's time to put some pressure on Charles." Haig's face was expressionless, his voice cold. "Give the newspapers and Parliament some information. Tell them Charles can't control the situation on the Somme." "Yes, General." After the staff officer left, Haig snorted. The British army had deployed hundreds of thousands of troops on the Somme. If Charles could stir up trouble with 200,000 mutinous soldiers, the British army would be disgraced, and Haig, as the commander, could even trigger a chain reaction in the colonies, shaking the very foundation of the British Empire. Haig was determined. He had to ensure that none of this would happen. Whether on the battlefield, in public opinion, or in politics. Chapter 557. Are you ready to fight? Haig revealed little information to the newspapers. He dared not expose the French mutiny at this stage. He wanted the Germans and Charles to weaken each other, not a complete collapse of the French army. Therefore, the media expressed more skepticism about Charles's appointment as commander of the Sixth Army. It's well known that Charles is better at mobile warfare. As commander of the Sixth Army, facing the Germans at the Somme, he will have to engage in positional warfare head-on, which will undoubtedly be a challenge for him. Charles has never commanded such a large army before. This may overwhelm him. This may not be a good thing for Charles. After all, he's only 18. Can he handle this immense pressure with his limited experience? We'll wait and see. Compared to the newspaper's lukewarm response, the Parliament's skepticism towards Charles was like a tidal wave. "I believe Charles doesn't know how to operate." He actually rejected the soldiers' demands for negotiation, and those demands weren't unreasonable. In the eyes of the parliamentarians, the soldiers' three demands were indeed not unreasonable: defense, leave, and Charles as commander-in-chief. If anything was unreasonable, it was the last one. Everyone knew they could agree first and then back out once the troops were back in control. Little did they know, the soldiers, repeatedly deceived, were already wary of such tactics. Instead, Charles's limited agreement was more convincing, as the soldiers generally believed this attitude showed a genuine consideration of the feasibility of the conditions. Yes, this is the main reason for the slow recovery at the front. He even sent Major General Raymond and his group to a military court. Did he know that Major General Raymond was on his side? The councillors naturally considered the soldiers as enemies, while believing that the officers under Major General Raymond's command were Charles's right-hand men. Charles, however, cut off his own right-hand men as soon as he arrived at the front, leaving him isolated and vulnerable. Having long been in Parliament, they didn't realize that if you treat soldiers as enemies, they will inevitably become enemies themselves. Charles, on the other hand, treated the soldiers as allies, while his so-called right-hand men were the real enemies. More importantly, Charles can't control the situation. I mean, what can he do on the Somme? That's large-scale frontal warfare, which Charles might not be good at. We need to strengthen our defenses immediately. This was Niveler's opinion. Although he had been dismissed, many people thought he had some merit. Charles lacked experience commanding 200,000 men. More importantly, Charles was good at offense, not defense. He was good at mobile warfare, not positional warfare. Now, what was needed on the Somme was defense, a defense that wouldn't collapse when the Germans launched a counter-offensive, and it was urgent. Gallieni gave the senator a cold glance, remaining silent. Did these guys really think that was all Charles was capable of? Just as Charles said, his tactics weren't offense or defense, but adaptability. Another meaning of adaptability was that he had no weaknesses. He attacked when he should attack and defended when he should defend. The Battle of Verdun had proven this, yet these fools still relentlessly slandered Charles. Steed and Wells didn't say much either. They knew what was going on. These members of Parliament didn't genuinely believe Charles was incompetent. They were merely being bribed by the British to promote him. Consider this: if Charles could achieve success at the Somme, how would you explain the British suffering 100,000 deaths a day with no progress? Many centrist members understood this perfectly. Some were indifferent, some indignant, and others wore expressions of mockery. But they were too lazy to argue, for these were a bunch of people feigning sleep. Arguing with him was pointless. Only Armand, seemingly enjoying the spectacle, rose casually and said sarcastically, "Gentlemen, what is your purpose in going to such lengths to prove to us that Charles can control this situation? Can I interpret this as us removing Charles and replacing him with someone else to lead the Somme? Then I'd like to know, who should we replace him with?" The room fell silent instantly. Good heavens, how could this be? Charles was the only one capable of stabilizing the defenses. To remove him? Insane. That would destroy France, destroy everything. Armand shook his head and sat back down, his eyes filled with disdain and disgust. These hypocritical bastards, they slandered Charles with their mouths but relied on him in action. Charles was on the front lines saving their lives, while they were acting as mouthpieces for the British in the rear. Gallery smiled and nodded at Armand. He found this royalist not so bad after all, at least he hadn't sold himself to the British. North bank of the Somme, British command post. The rain intensified, and the Somme rose. A large area of shallow water along the bank was now completely submerged, and a patch of foxtail grass struggled in the rising water, seemingly trying to escape. Haig, in a semi-buried bunker, peered through binoculars at the French troops on the south bank of the Somme. They remained motionless. The staff officer reported from the side, "Our propaganda campaign in the newspapers and Parliament hasn't been very effective. Charles's achievements are deeply ingrained in people's minds. Everyone believes he can hold the line. At the same time, the members of Parliament are convinced that no one is more suitable than Charles." Haig hummed in agreement. This was within his expectations. Charles's military exploits were dazzling, as were his inventions. Each one could be described as a miracle. He was the hope of France, the god of war, an unshakable belief. To bring him down with propaganda alone was simply wishful thinking. However, this was merely a prelude for Haig. When the time was right, the German army would launch an offensive and crush Charles's forces, allowing Haig to easily destroy this belief. "How many troops has Charles gathered?" Haig asked. This was the most important question. "Another 30,000 returned today," the staff officer replied. "So far, there are about 130,000, Haig secretly praised him. Charles was truly remarkable. He had gathered most of the 210,000 troops in just a few days. In a few more days, the Sixth Army would likely be fully recovered. It was almost time to act. Any later and the Germans might not be able to push through. After all, it was Charles. Thinking this, Haig beckoned to his staff officer, who then whispered something in his ear as the officer leaned closer. The staff officer looked at Haig in shock, seemingly unable to believe what he had heard. But seeing the certainty and determination on Haig's face, he managed a labored reply, "Yes, General." Haig's gaze returned to the direction of the French army on the south bank, a cold smile playing on his lips. The show was about to begin. Mars of France, were you ready for battle? Chapter 558. Knowing the answer at the lowest cost. The Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin was pitch black late at night, except for the lights in the General Staff headquarters. Since the start of the Battle of the Somme, the lights in the General Staff had never been turned off, with staff officers working in 2 shifts day and night to monitor and command the battle at the front. For Germany, the Battle of the Somme was a victory, a true victory. They traded several square kilometers of defense for the lives of hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers, suffering less than half the casualties of the enemy. Even Kaiser Wilhelm II exclaimed, "We originally intended to bleed the French dry at Verdun, but we did it at the Somme, including the British. Unbelievable. Why did they attack the Somme, where our defenses were strongest, instead of elsewhere? Was it just because we attacked Verdun?" Verdun was the strongest French defense, and the Allies seemed to be retaliating in kind. But the difference was that Verdun, under Joffre's orders, had largely withdrawn its defenses, making it merely a facade, while the Germans were fully prepared at the Somme. If it weren't for Charles's surprise attack on Namur, which made the German situation in Belgium even more dire, the recent performance of the German army would have been perfect. Falkenhayn, who had been directing the battle without sleep for several days, finally collapsed and fell asleep in the rest room. However, he felt he had barely closed his eyes when there was a soft knock on the door. Falkenhayn was startled awake and sat up in bed. He stared blankly for a moment, his mind blank, unsure of what was happening. Just then, Colonel Moritz's report came from outside. "General, intelligence from the front is about Charles." Charles? Falkenhayn jumped out of bed, hurriedly put on his boots, and opened the door. Before he even stepped out, he anxiously asked, "Charles has launched another attack. If there was anything to worry about, It was only Charles. No, General, Colonel Moritz replied. Charles has been transferred to the Somme to command the French 6th Army. What? Fauconheim was taken aback, then quickened his pace to his desk, glancing at the Somme on it. What about Belgium? I mean, Charles's troops, were they also transferred to the Somme? Not entirely sure. Colonel Moritz handed Fauconheim a telegram. But I think you need to know this more. Fauconheim took the telegram, glanced at it, and looked incredulous. Soon, the weariness on his face vanished, replaced by ecstatic joy. Is it true? A large-scale mutiny in the French army? Including the 6th Army on the Somme? I think it's true. Colonel Moritz nodded. I heard they relieved Commander-in-Chief Nevelevly's post, and a new Commander-in-Chief hasn't been elected yet. The French army is in chaos. Yes, Fauconheim paced excitedly. That's why they transferred Charles to the Somme, because only he can stabilize the lines and keep morale high. Then he cursed. Damn it, we should have acted sooner. He's probably already there. This was due to the lag in intelligence. But the next second, Fauconheim hesitated, standing there staring thoughtfully at the map. Colonel Moritz seemed to see through his thoughts and cautiously asked, General, do you suspect this is another trap set by Charles? Fauconheim slowly nodded. It seems too obvious. Could it be that Charles wants us to launch an attack? You know, the Anglo-French forces suffered heavy losses in the Somme offensive, while we maintained a defensive posture, leaving them no opening. Colonel Moritz agreed. Charles is too cunning. Everything he shows us, everything he tells us, could be a deception. Colonel Moritz had already been traumatized by Charles's deception regarding the gasoline incident. Fauconheim frowned. This troubled him greatly. If the large-scale mutiny of the French army was real, this was a golden opportunity for a counter-offensive, potentially even completely defeating the French and ending the entire Western Front campaign. But if this was Charles's lie, the German counter-offensive could suffer heavy casualties. At this point, the German army was severely understrength due to fighting on multiple fronts. Further heavy casualties could prevent them from filling the gaps and lead to complete collapse. Fauconheim sighed, caught in a dilemma. Which option should he choose? General, Colonel Moritz suggested, why don't we target the Somme? Target the Somme? Fauconheim looked at Moritz with confusion, then understood. Launch a localized offensive on the Somme, finding out the answer with minimal losses. Yes, Colonel Moritz replied, we can prepare for a counter-offensive in other directions. Once we have the answer, we can make the right choice. Fauconheim nodded slightly, considered for a moment, and then ordered General Bello to prepare for a counter-offensive immediately. Note, the 2nd Army, commanded by General von Bello, was defending the Somme. At 5 in the morning, an hour before dawn. The Somme battlefield, usually in the midst of a major battle, was unusually calm today. Strong winds and rain swept across the battlefield, seemingly washing away the corpses and blood left behind. The French soldiers had not slept all night. Their trenches weren't as well prepared as the Germans. The Germans had anticipated the rainy season and dug drainage ditches in advance, so even their underground fortifications, several meters deep, rarely experienced backflow. The British and French trenches, however, were inadequate. Water accumulation in their fortifications was common, and sometimes heavy rains would flood the entire trenches, resulting in soldiers drowning before they could escape. That night, the French soldiers spent the entire night bailing water. Fortunately, they were now wearing iron helmets, unlike before when they only had red cloth hats. Otherwise, they wouldn't even have the tools to bail water. Captain Jeremiah was also among those bailing water. While directing his men, he shook his head and sighed. These bastards. Because they were lazy and didn't do proper drainage, we lost another batch of valuable supplies. These were supplies sent by Charles, purchased at a high price using his personal wealth. Many items had only arrived a few days prior and been distributed to the soldiers, but were immediately flooded. Flour, blankets, bread, and winter clothing, all became useless. Captain Jeremy, braving the rain, glanced towards the German positions. In this weather, surely the Germans wouldn't attack. However, as if in response, several red signal flares suddenly rose into the sky. Then, to Captain Jeremy's alarm, a deafening roar of artillery fire erupted from the German direction. Prepare for battle, Captain Jeremy shouted, quickly pulling his helmet over his head. This was pre-attack artillery preparation. Jeremy sensed something was wrong. The Germans must have known something, and they were about to attack. Chapter 559 Charles begins his counterattack. Haig was awakened from his sleep by the sound of artillery fire. He jumped out of bed, flung open the door, and rushed to the observation window, raising his binoculars. The French positions on the south bank were engulfed in flames, as if submerged in a sea of fire, while the British positions were virtually untouched. Clearly, the Germans had concentrated their fire on the south bank of the Somme, launching an attack on the French lines. A smug smile appeared on Haig's face. The battle was unfolding as he had hoped, and he would soon hear Charles and the Parliament's cries for help. After a moment's consideration, Haig ordered his staff, notify the French Ministry of War that the Germans have launched a sudden attack, concentrated on the French lines on the south bank of the Somme. Yes, General, Haig smiled slightly. He was happy to share this good news with Paris. At the Palais Bourbon in Paris, besides the Parliament building, there were over 100 auxiliary buildings, including accommodations for visiting members of Parliament. Therefore, even though Parliament was under martial law and almost completely isolated from the outside world, the members of Parliament were still able to maintain their elegance, living in private rooms and enjoying fine dining. Gallery also lived there, having specifically chosen the ground floor to better keep the members of Parliament from wandering off. Unlike the members, he, responsible for martial law, maintained constant contact with the outside world and relayed information to the Parliament in real time. At 5:10 a.m., Gallery was still asleep, but he was already wide awake. He had debated with the members of Parliament for a long time the previous night, concluding that the most urgent task was to elect a commander-in-chief to take charge. The crisis of mutiny at the front was not limited to the Somme. Although the Somme was the source, it had spread to other areas and was still expanding. Charles could only stabilize the situation at the Somme. He was powerless to intervene in other directions. If the German army launched a full-scale counter-offensive, the blow to the French army would still be fatal. However, the Parliament was known for its slowness, taking several days to tentatively select candidates: Pétain, Foch, and Charles. Charles was only nominated, proposed by Steed, Wells, and a few others. But Gallery knew in his heart that Charles had no chance of being elected. It wasn't that Charles wasn't good enough, but rather that he was too good, so good that Parliament saw him as a potential dictator who might not even need Parliament. Whoever it is, let's elect him as soon as possible, Gallery thought. In the current situation, even electing idiots like Joffre or Nivelle would be better than having no commander-in-chief. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Before Gallery could respond, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand's anxious voice came through. "General, the Germans have launched an attack. On the Somme, they were only attacking the French lines." Gallery's face changed drastically, and he sat bolt upright in bed as if pricked by a needle. Only attacking the French lines? The Germans must know something. Who leaked the information? Gallery quickly dressed in his uniform and ordered, "Wake everyone up. Immediately. Convene an emergency meeting." "Yes, General," Lieutenant Colonel Fernand replied. In the Bourbon Palace meeting room, members of Parliament entered in twos and threes and took their seats, appearing calm and composed. They had no concept of an emergency meeting, and any topic would drag on for days. Getting up at 5 a.m. was already considered a great favor. If Lieutenant Colonel Fernand hadn't deployed his guards, each responsible for urging one member of Parliament, they probably wouldn't have gathered for at least an hour. After all, once they got up, they needed to wash up, have breakfast, chat while eating, and perhaps even try on several outfits. "Gentlemen," Gallery couldn't wait any longer. Before everyone was seated, he announced loudly, "We've just received news that the Germans have launched an attack on the Somme." The meeting hall erupted in commotion. The members of Parliament paled, and those still looking for seats froze, staring blankly at Gallery. "It's obvious," Gallery added. "The Germans know something. They were only attacking the south bank of the Somme, which is the French defensive line." The members of Parliament grew increasingly uneasy, discussing amongst themselves, "Someone must have leaked the information. The Germans know the French army is in the midst of a massive mutiny. Now it's up to Charles. Hopefully, he can hold off the German advance. We should send reinforcements. We can't put all our hopes on Charles." But immediately, someone objected to this idea. "Send reinforcements? Don't you know mutiny is spreading like a plague? If we send reinforcements to the front, they might also be infected and mutiny. We can only deploy them in the rear. That way, at least we can provide Paris with an additional layer of protection." Providing Paris with an additional layer of protection was a pretext. The real purpose was to protect the members of Parliament and give them time to retreat. Everyone knew that if the main forces of the three army groups at the front were destroyed, the remaining, Weakest reserve army group under Gallieri's command would be unable to hold out alone, and France would be close to its demise. At this moment, Lieutenant General Avis, who was confined here due to martial law, could no longer contain himself. As a British Army commander, Lieutenant General Avis originally had little say in Parliament. But in this critical period, having control over supplies naturally granted them a certain privilege, or rather, he perceived it as such. "Gentlemen," Lieutenant General Avis strode confidently onto the podium, his tone revealing a hint of smugness despite his attempts to conceal it, "I believe now is the time for unity. We will not stand idly by while our allies are in danger. I also believe that only through deeper cooperation can we resolve the current crisis." A round of applause erupted in the meeting room, with members nodding in approval. "This is our steadfast ally. Only Britain can save France now." "He's right, we can no longer defend our individual lines as before, otherwise, the Germans will defeat us piecemeal." Stead, Wells, and a group of centrist members remained expressionless. They knew that Lieutenant General Avis's words sounded nice, but they also implied, "Kneel down, we will protect you." The so-called deeper cooperation meant allowing the British to infiltrate various French command structures and gain complete control over the course of the war. Gallieni understood this, but was helpless. Compared to the Germans reaching Paris and forcing France to surrender, Avis's proposal was perhaps more acceptable. Just as Gallieni was struggling with this dilemma, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand Rushton, "General, Charles has begun its counter-offensive." "What? A counter-offensive?" Gallieni was stunned. The members of Parliament also stared at Lieutenant Colonel Fernand in disbelief. It wasn't even dawn yet, the German artillery preparations weren't finished, meaning the German offensive hadn't even begun, and Charles had already launched a counter-offensive? With an army that had recently been in a state of mutiny, whose morale hadn't fully recovered, a counter-offensive. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 560 Somme River Crossing. Upon hearing that Charles has launched a counterattack, Elvis smiled slightly, his eyes filled with mockery. He's only 18 after all, he can't maintain composure in the face of such a large force. Reminded by Lieutenant General Elvis, the councillors naturally recalled their earlier statement that Charles lacked experience commanding large-scale frontal battles. The councillors nodded in agreement. How can he launch a counterattack now? Shouldn't they be organizing a defense? The soldiers at the front negotiated on the condition of defense, and Charles is doing the opposite. This could easily cause another mutiny. The Germans can kill or wound 100,000 British soldiers a day in a defensive posture. We can do the same. God, Charles missed a golden opportunity. He chose to gamble everything. Gallieri still didn't believe that Charles would recklessly launch a counterattack at this time, let alone that it was a gamble. If it were, it would be a prepared counterattack. He stood up and shouted to the crowd, "Why don't we give Charles some time? Things might not be as you think," but his voice was quickly drowned out by the opposition of the members of Parliament. "We don't have time, Your Excellency Minister. The already chaotic army may collapse as a result. This is clearly a mistake. We should stop Charles's actions immediately. Yes, command should be handed over to General Haig so that he can take unified command of the battle at the front." Wells and Steed exchanged a glance and smiled slightly. They knew that Charles was prepared, and very well prepared, although they did not know the specifics of Charles's plan. On the south bank of the Somme, Charles's counter-offensive officially began. In the past few days, Charles had made some preparations. He secretly transferred a regiment of rocket artillery from Tigny's hands to the Somme. Only artillery, no rocket artillery. Charles was worried that a large-scale transfer would arouse suspicion in the Germans and cause them to abandon the offensive on the Somme. On the other hand, Charles also transferred a batch of landing craft and amphibious landing ships from Wells. 12 of the landing craft were modified, each equipped with 10 rocket launchers. The other 12 were large landing craft, each capable of carrying a Char A-1 tank. At the Palais Bourbon in Paris, Lieutenant General Avis had his assistant project a map of the Somme River onto a screen behind the podium. Confidently wielding his baton, he pointed out, "The Germans' defenses on the Somme are extremely tight, practically impenetrable. The heavy casualties suffered by the British and French on the Somme are for a reason. It's not a tactical issue, but purely due to the battlefield environment. What I mean is, even if Char were to organize a counter-offensive on the Somme, it wouldn't change just because Char is in command. At the headquarters of the 1st Special Artillery Division on the south bank of the Somme, pointing to the Somme River on the map, Charles said to Christine, who is in charge of the main attack, "Everyone has overlooked one thing. The Somme flows from west to east straight into the German rear." Christine's eyes lit up. Yes, the Somme River could be used for a rapid infiltration. How come I didn't think of that? But he immediately frowned. "General, isn't this too dangerous? The Germans have artillery on both the south and north banks. Once they discover us, at that time, all the artillery fire would create a barrage across the Somme in the form of crossfire, and the troops infiltrating along the river would be blasted into the air in an instant." But Charles calmly replied, "We can wait for the Germans to launch their attack." Christine was taken aback, then suddenly realized, the Germans will definitely have artillery preparation before attacking, and usually they will do so before dawn. Darkness and artillery fire will mask the sounds of the infiltrating troops. Charles added, "It will also reveal the position of their artillery." Christine's face lit up instantly. "That's right, General. While the enemy artillery is still firing at our lines, they won't know that our infiltrating troops have already landed next to them. We can crush the enemy artillery immediately." At the Palais Bourbon in Paris, Lieutenant General Avis began his performance. He feigned deep sorrow, sighing as he gazed at the map on the screen. "It's not hard to imagine this will be another massacre. Worse still, it's still dark, which is extremely disadvantageous for the attacking side. The Germans only need to fire a few flares to slaughter our soldiers as they traverse the mud, craters, and barbed wire." The members of Parliament were indignant, condemning Charles's utterly irresponsible actions. "This is tantamount to murder. He doesn't know what he's doing. He'll kill us. We can't let him continue down this path. We must do something, or it will be too late." South bank of the Somme. As the Germans began their artillery preparations at 5 a.m., the French infiltration forces, already concealed on the bank, simultaneously began their operation. They pushed landing craft down the prepared channels and methodically guided tanks onto the landing craft. The bearded man commanded the naval operations. This task should have been done by Tigny, given his naval knowledge and experience in commanding amphibious landings. But Tigny needed to be stationed in Namur, and Charles's move to Namur would be too obvious. It would clearly signal to the Germans that he was prepared on the Somme. So Charles had to search within the army. Surprisingly, a quick check revealed many naval veterans, including the bearded man. Even more astonishing to Charles was that this bearded man called himself Darla. Darla, the future Grand Admiral? And yet, he was one of the mutiny leaders. The image above shows François Darla, Grand Admiral, Commander-in-Chief of the Vichy Navy, Acting Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of the Navy, and Minister of the Interior. He was the second most powerful figure in the Vichy government, second only to Pétain. A naval artillery specialist during World War I, he was deployed to Verdun as part of the army artillery. As a Grand Admiral, his combat experience was limited to land artillery battles. Perhaps Nivelle had transferred troops originally intended for Verdun to the Somme, Charles thought, which explained Darla's presence there. But Charles looked at the disheveled future fleet admiral before him. "Why would you become a mutiny representative?" Darling interrupted Charles. "Yes," Charles nodded. "As a future fleet admiral, he should be of noble birth. Becoming a mutiny representative was strange." "Because I thought I was going to die, General," Darling answered earnestly, "like everyone else. I didn't want to die meaninglessly." He then gave Charles a grateful look, but thankfully, none of that happened. Charles nodded in understanding. "Then, what if it had been meaningful? I mean, you might have sacrificed yourself in this battle." Darling straightened up. "I believe you, General. Give the order. I will prove my courage with my actions." Chapter 561 We've won. Lieutenant General Avis pointed his baton to the German lines on the map, his tone light. "The key is the German artillery. We all know that German artillery has the advantage, while the French army only has 75 mm infantry guns. Their range is far insufficient to contend with the Germans. In the Somme region, the Allied artillery had the upper hand because the British had concentrated thousands of guns of various calibers." The members of Parliament nodded in agreement. They seemed to see the horrific scene of French soldiers being blown to pieces by German 105 mm guns. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. Amidst the whistling sounds, rockets streaked towards the German 105 mm artillery positions. These were landing craft equipped with rocket launchers. They were sailing downstream along the Somme, at the rear of the column, but because of their 8-kilometer range, they were the first to engage the enemy. The 12 modified landing craft, equipped with a total of 120 rocket launchers, emptied their 1,440 rockets within minutes. A volley of rockets, carrying the scent of death, roared through the sky, leaving long trails in their wake. Explosions followed immediately, deafeningly loud, the sky instantly engulfed in flames and thick smoke. German artillery pieces and corpses, blown into the air, darted about in the light and smoke. Occasionally, artillery shells would detonate, creating mushroom clouds, their flames leaping and licking at everything flammable around them. On the north bank of the Somme, Haig, who had been watching the spectacle with a sense of schadenfreude, was horrified by the scene. "What's that?" Haig exclaimed. "The French blew up the German ammunition depot? But they don't have artillery with such a long range," the staff officer, seeing it clearly, reported. "General, that's a rocket, a rocket." Haig's expression hardened. He put away his binoculars and turned to look at the staff officer. "You mean the rocket that Charles used at Namur? It actually has a longer range than the German 105mm artillery, General." The staff officer pointed to the rocket launch site, where a large cloud of smoke still lingered. "That should be the Somme River." "The Somme River?" Haig was shocked. Rockets could be launched from a river? Then he understood, it was a boat. That bastard Charles had loaded rockets onto a boat and launched them at the enemy. In the Paris Chamber of Deputies, Lieutenant General Avis calmly drew his baton along the German front line. "The Germans will build anti-tank ditches here, wide and deep enough to stop any tank attempting to cross. Charles used bridging vehicles for rapid trench crossings in Namur, but that won't work here. The Germans have already aimed a large number of artillery pieces at the anti-tank ditches. They will destroy any vehicle approaching them, including bridging vehicles." The councillors' faces turned ashen. Charles must not have known any of this, which was why he launched such a rash counterattack. The Charles A-1 tanks rattled as they rolled ashore from the landing craft. The Germans were completely unaware. The sounds of artillery fire and dense rocket fire masked everything else. Due to days of heavy rain and swollen rivers, the landing craft didn't lower their landing boards until they reached hard ground, and 12 tanks rolled off one after another. Around them were squads of French soldiers who had boarded amphibious landing craft. As soon as they reached the shore, they jumped off, rifles in hand, and stood in front of and behind the tanks. Major General Christine personally led the team. After disembarking, he cautiously glanced ahead and then around, drawing his revolver from his waist and ordering, "Advance." The tanks rumbled, carrying the soldiers forward in an orderly fashion, their speed increasing until they soon stormed into the enemy's artillery positions. The German artillerymen, still reeling from the rocket fire, were struggling to recover. Some ran around tending to the wounded, others contacted observers by telephone, and many more, under the command of their officers, busied themselves adjusting their guns to launch a counterattack against the rocket launchers. Suddenly, in the dim light of dawn, a group of enemy soldiers, equipped with tanks, stormed into the artillery positions like tigers among sheep, firing indiscriminately. Grenades exploded, and stray bullets felled artillerymen who hadn't even had time to pick up their rifles, leaving them in pools of blood. A tank slammed into a cannon, its tracks mercilessly crushing the fallen barrel, producing a series of mournful, agonizing sounds of steel breaking. Tank guns spewed flames, turning an ammunition truck in front of them into a fireball, and nearby German soldiers were thrown into the air in a bright flash. Paris Chamber of Deputies. Lieutenant General Avis shook his head, his face somber but a smile playing on his lips. "Gentlemen, it's too late. No one could have imagined that Charles would choose to attack, especially at this time. Now, only the British Army can save France. Only if they cross the Somme in time to reinforce the south bank and fill the gap will the Germans not overwhelm our defenses like a flood." Chaos erupted in the chamber, members whispering amongst themselves. Then someone stood up and urged, "What are we waiting for? Make a decision. We should unify command." Unifying command meant handing command over to Haig. The members nodded in agreement. In their view, this was the best option. Galleri was pale. He knew the members would pass the resolution, no matter how much he opposed it. Because most people had already believed Lieutenant General Avis's words. Staff distributed ballots to the members of Parliament, collected them one by one after they were filled out, and finally counted the votes while they were read aloud from the podium. Just as Galleri had expected, the majority of members chose unified command, and it was an overwhelming majority. However, Just as the vote counting was nearing its end, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand suddenly pushed open the parliament doors and shouted excitedly at Gallieni, "General, we have won!" The members of parliament gasped, all turning their gazes to Lieutenant Colonel Fernand. Even the vote counters stopped what they were doing. "What victory?" someone asked. Lieutenant General Ives hesitated for a moment, then confidently said, "It must be the British reinforcements. They repelled the Germans." Gallieni involuntarily stood up and looked at Lieutenant Colonel Fernand. He also wanted to know the answer. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand clenched his fist and waved it in front of his chest. "It was Charles, General. Charles' counter-offensive defeated the Germans. The Germans collapsed completely, and our army advanced 5 kilometers in one go." 5 kilometers, the hall erupted in uproar. Was this possible? The counterattack actually succeeded, and they even advanced 5 kilometers? Lieutenant General Elvis's smile froze on his face. No, this couldn't be real. There was no reason for this outcome. Gallieni laughed heartily. "I knew it. This little guy wouldn't let me down." He took a few steps and stood at the edge of the gallery, proudly puffing out his chest and looking down at the members of parliament below. His voice was clear and powerful, yet full of sarcasm. "Gentlemen, you can continue voting now. Hand over command to the British." Chapter 562. On the north bank of the Somme, at the British command post, Haig sat dazed in his chair, the cheers from the south bank echoing in his ears. "Long live France! We've won!" The telephone on his desk rang. Haig felt nothing. It was as if everything was irrelevant to him. Only one question occupied his mind. Why had this happened? What magic did Charles possess? A staff officer quickly answered the phone, then cautiously handed the receiver to Haig. "General, it's the Marshal." Haig quickly cleared his throat, but a sense of powerlessness still lingered as he took the receiver. "It's me, Haig." Kitchener's incredulous voice came through the receiver. "Is it true? Charles won the counter-offensive?" "Yes, Your Excellency," Haig answered with difficulty, though he couldn't believe it either. It was true. "How did he do it?" Kitchener asked again. Haig loosened his collar in frustration, his voice tinged with embarrassment. I'm not quite sure yet, Your Excellency. Everything had happened too fast. If it hadn't happened right under his nose, if he hadn't witnessed the German retreat, if he hadn't heard the cheers of the French, Haig would have almost thought it was a charade orchestrated by the Germans and Charles. "God, Douglas," Kitchener exclaimed, his voice laced with displeasure. "The battle is happening right beside you, and you don't even know how he defeated the Germans." But what truly angered Kitchener wasn't this. The British army had suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties and advanced only 1 kilometer in over 20 days, while Charles had advanced 5 kilometers in just a few hours, with casualties likely less than a fraction of the British. But Kitchener couldn't say that, because all of Haig's battle plans had been approved by Kitchener. In other words, Charles had defeated not only Haig, but also Kitchener. "Yes," Haig said dejectedly, "I'm sorry, Your Excellency. I will investigate immediately and report back to you." Kitchener said nothing, simply grunted an and hung up. The staff officer, quick to understand, stepped forward and reported the situation before Haig could ask. "Information I received from the French, General. Charles is infiltrating along the Somme River into the German rear." Haig couldn't believe his ears. "The Somme?" The staff officer nodded. "Yes, General. He secretly deployed many landing craft and amphibious assault ships. You know, Charles invented these during the Dardanelles attack. They've obviously been upgraded. The landing craft can carry tanks and rocket launchers, and the amphibious assault ships can carry soldiers and ammunition." The staff officer then searched the map for a moment, pointing to a spot. "They landed here, near Bugova village, directly attacking the German artillery positions." Haig impatiently interrupted the staff officer. "But how did they fool the Germans? How could the Germans ignore the movement on the river?" "The darkness, General," the staff officer explained, "along with the artillery fire and the flashes of exploding shells, provided excellent cover." Haig stared blankly for a moment, then finally let out a long sigh. Foolish Germans. They had perfectly coordinated with Charles's battle plan. Haig spent a few minutes processing the whole situation and then called Kitchener to report the whole thing. Kitchener listened and fell silent as well. Soon, Kitchener said slowly and earnestly, "You might have overlooked something, Douglas." "What?" Haig felt he hadn't missed anything. "The artillery fire," Kitchener reminded him. Charles knew the Germans would attack. He was prepared for this moment. Haig suddenly realized. Yes, as soon as the Germans opened fire, Charles's troops immediately took advantage of the moment to advance along the Somme River. This wasn't a coincidence. Charles had guessed the Germans would attack. But how could he have guessed the Germans would attack? The French army was under martial law. They were trying their best to prevent the Germans from knowing about the mutiny. Kitchener warned into the microphone, "He knows what you're going to do." Haig was utterly shocked. "You mean, no, that's impossible." There was no response from the other end of the line. Clearly, Kitchener was certain of the answer. Haig still refused to admit it, but it seemed to be the only explanation. In other words, what he thought was a secret operation was actually part of Charles's plan. Finally, Kitchener asked in a warning tone, "Now, do you still think Charles's victory was due to luck?" Haig was speechless. He couldn't even utter a denial. That afternoon, the gallery devoted a full page to a detailed report on Charles's Battle of the Somme. This was the result of Cobdeau's busy day. Upon hearing the news, he immediately flew to the Somme front, spent several hours gathering the necessary materials and taking photographs, and then rushed back to Paris to edit and print. This time, the Honorable's newspaper abandoned its previous so-called neutrality, showering Charles with every conceivable compliment it could muster. Many say Charles lacks the ability to command large armies and has little experience in direct combat and positional warfare. This has proven to be a lie. Charles is the one who grasps the lifeline of the war, a true genius, proficient in all tactics. Just as Charles has always emphasized, adaptability. Has no one realized that adaptability also means being a jack of all trades? While the newspaper reported more on how Charles used the Somme to infiltrate behind German lines and the course of the battle, these were the details that people were more interested in and willing to read. Paris was once again in an uproar over this battle, and people naturally compared it to previous ones. Is it true? Charles only suffered a little over 1,000 casualties in this battle. Unbelievable. Advancing 5 kilometers at the cost of just over 1,000 men. The Anglo-French forces have lost at least hundreds of thousands on this land. It's true. Some wounded soldiers have already been sent to Paris. They say it was hardly an offensive. The Germans were retreating from the start, and they were chasing the Germans. This was indeed true. The battlefield situation was that a unit suddenly appeared in the rear and successively routed 3 German artillery regiments, terrifying the German troops who were preparing to attack at the front. They thought they were surrounded by the enemy and hurriedly turned to flee. French soldiers followed the Germans, firing all the way, and those who ran too slowly couldn't catch up. This made the citizens of Paris very proud, not only because they had defeated the Germans, but also because they had outshone the British on the same battlefield. Chapter 563. The guest takes over the host. A steady, fine winter rain fell silently into the Somme. A dozen landing craft were moored on the bank, soldiers braving the rain to unload supplies. These would be converted into transport boats after the battle. Along the bank, trenches wound their way to the horizon, disappearing into the rain and the pale light of dawn. Charles's command post had moved into the German-built trenches. The spacious underground tunnels, supported by logs, were clean and smooth, the bedding and floor were dry, and they had even dug a stove for warmth. Charles glanced at Christine, who had followed him in. Christine looked ashamed. After seeing the German trenches, she never wanted to go back to the French trenches. They were nothing short of a shanty. "Do you know why the Germans are so powerful?" Charles looked around and sighed. "They treat fighting as life, while we treat life as fighting." "Yes, General," Christine replied. He understood the difference. In such conditions, the German army could conserve its strength, ready to unleash its full combat power should battle break out. The French army, on the other hand, suffered greatly from the terrible weather and harsh environment, which drained most of their energy, and supplies were frequently wasted due to dampness. A soldier added a few more pieces of firewood to the stove, and the already flickering flame soon leaped up joyfully, crackling and adding light and warmth to the tunnel. Charles took off his raincoat and then his military jacket, sitting in front of the stove to dry himself. In the rain, raincoats were often ineffective, inevitably soaking and soiling the clothes underneath. This was why many soldiers simply didn't wear them. Raincoats were more of a burden, hindering their movements and making them a step slower than the enemy. Within the time it takes to drink a cup of tea, the communications soldier had set up the radio and begun receiving messages. Soon a telegram was delivered to Charles. "General, the majority of the 6th Army has returned to its posts, totaling over 200,000 men, and forces in other directions are also under control." Charles, holding his hot coffee, hummed in agreement. This was one of the benefits of the successful Somme crossing. Prior to this, all the mutinous soldiers, including those in the Sixth Army, were worried about whether Charles could avoid meaningless attacks as much as possible. This negotiating condition was essentially an unquantifiable, empty promise. What constituted a meaningless attack? What were the standards? Was it reducing the daily casualties from 100,000 to 90,000, or even 80,000? Because of this, the mutinous soldiers were still unwilling to compromise easily. They wanted a definite answer or a guarantee from Charles. However, Charles, commanding 130,000 nearly collapsed Sixth Army soldiers, easily routed the 200,000-strong German Second Army, suffering only a little over 1,000 casualties while killing and wounding over 10,000 German soldiers and advancing the defensive line by 5 kilometers. This was the best answer for the soldiers. This was the meaningful attack they wanted. This was the battle they desired. If they could fight such a battle, live with honor, dignity, and pride, and not be herded like sheep to the enemy's guns to die meaninglessly in no man's land, rotting and stinking, why would they mutiny? As a result, the morale of the French army on the Western Front soared, and soldiers returned to their posts and obeyed officers' commands. Christine took the telegram and examined it carefully, then frowned. "General, something seems wrong." "What's wrong?" Charles put down his coffee cup and spread his wet uniform out in front of the fire. Christine handed him the telegram, which Charles took with one hand, glancing at it in the flickering firelight. It seemed to be statistics from the various divisions within the army group. "The data doesn't include the 1st Special Artillery Division," Christine said. "The reason is that the 1st Special Artillery Division is in the best condition. Most of them returned to their posts shortly after your arrival." This was related to Christine's military discipline. In addition, he was a combat hero, often charging at the forefront in battle, and was deeply loved by his soldiers. However, Charles still didn't understand. "What's the problem, General?" Christine explained. "The entire Sixth Army has 213,000 men, but the count is 205,000, not including the 13,000 of the 1st Special Artillery Division." Charles was taken aback, and after a moment's thought, he understood. "You mean, a few thousand more?" Christine nodded. "Yes, General, about 5,000 more," but then he thought something was wrong, and Christine corrected him. "It should be 6,000 more. We didn't include our casualties of over 1,000. This puzzled Charles. He'd only ever heard of men decreasing in number as the fighting went on, never increasing. Was the count wrong? Unlikely. This was reported by each unit level by head count. Were there militia mixed in? Also unlikely. The Belgians might be enthusiastic, but the French would avoid any draft. Then, Christine laughed. "General, they want to be part of the Sixth Army," reminded. Charles said, "Oh." Understanding dawned on him. Soldiers from other units were defecting to the Sixth Army, all for Charles. Only Charles could launch such a meaningful offensive, giving them dignity, honor, and victory. "What should we do?" Christine asked, then answered herself. "For morale reasons, I think we should pretend we don't know." "No," Charles shook his head. "We must send them back to their original units. More than 6,000 men a day, and that's without permission. If we allow it, the entire defensive line could desert to the Somme and join the Sixth Army." Christine's expression changed slightly. "That was tantamount to a mutiny. The Germans could easily break through the lines and attack Paris." Charles wasn't just thinking about that. Allowing soldiers from other units to join the Sixth Army would be military dictatorship. The soldiers would have no connection to Parliament or the Commander-in-Chief. They would only obey Charles's orders, and Charles would face Parliament directly and turn against everyone else. Now was not the time, Charles thought. Just then, another telegram arrived. "General, Parliament has decided to appoint Foch as Commander-in-Chief." A satisfied smile appeared on Charles's lips. This was what he wanted. Those cunning old foxes in Parliament had finally fallen for it, along with the British. And, the messenger reported again, "To reward your contributions to France, and also to give you some rest, Parliament has decided to grant you a week's leave." Charles was stunned. A week's leave? At this time? Christine was equally perplexed. Shouldn't Charles be at the front lines now, stabilizing the newly restored morale? The next second, Charles understood. They wanted Foch, the newly appointed commander-in-chief, to take control. If Charles remained at the front, he might usurp the leadership. Chapter 564. It seems we made the right choice. On the third floor of the Paris government building, in the Military Research Center, several assistants pretended to be busy amidst piles of documents and materials. Foch sat at his desk, idly waving a pencil, the notebook on the table blank. He was drafting his defamatory arguments against Charles, hoping to make everyone believe Foch was Charles's enemy. However, Charles was almost perfect. In the recent battle, no one expected him to use the Somme River to flank and outflank the Germans, ultimately achieving a feat that the British and French forces, who had lost hundreds of thousands, had failed to accomplish with only 1,000 casualties. This made it impossible for Foch to say a few bad words or find fault with him. Tactics not perfect? If this wasn't perfect, what could be? Not pursuing the victory? This was due to a mutiny at the front. The soldiers needed time to recover. If there was any flaw, it was that he had infuriated the British and thwarted their attempt to infiltrate and control the French army. A slight smile unconsciously appeared on Foch's face. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Before Foch could respond, Clemenceau appeared at the door, a cane in one hand and a briefcase in the other, calmly asking, "General, may we speak alone?" "Of course," Foch replied, rising to greet him and gesturing for his dawdling assistants to leave. Once the unrelated individuals had left, Clemenceau closed the door and shook Foch's hand. "Congratulations, General. I am informing you on behalf of Parliament that you are now..." Clemenceau took the letter of appointment from his bag and handed it to Foch. "You are now the Commander-in-Chief of the French army, and concurrently the Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces." Foch's eyes lit up, joy practically bursting forth, his entire being radiating light. "Really?" Foch excitedly accepted the letter of appointment. "Thank you very much, Your Excellency. This is truly unexpected." In truth, Foch was not surprised at all. He had already made contact with the British, as Charles had instructed, though unwillingly. The reason Parliament had delayed the appointment until now was because the British were waiting for the outcome of the Battle of the Somme. If Charles had lost the Battle of the Somme, the British could have used the pretext of deep cooperation to infiltrate the French military and political system at will. At that point, they would have preferred the more easily controlled Pétain as commander-in-chief, even knowing Pétain supported Charles. But now Charles had won, and won decisively at that. This stabilized the front lines, the army, and the French political situation, leaving the British no opening. So, as before, they could only create an adversary for Charles within the French army, Foch. This was Charles's victory on another battlefield. Foch thought. The British, even Parliament, had been completely outmaneuvered. Clemenceau remained remarkably calm. This wasn't his main purpose for being there, otherwise, there would have been no need for a private talk. Foch understood this as well, inviting Clemenceau to sit on the sofa and casually making him a cup of coffee. Even as commander-in-chief, Foch still dared not offend those who wielded considerable influence in Parliament. Clemenceau accepted the coffee and thanks, added a sugar cube, and stirred it gently. His tone was casual, but actually probing, "You know. Although Charles has repeatedly distinguished himself in battle, many believe he's too young to command an army of hundreds of thousands. What are your thoughts on this?" It sounded like an ordinary question, but it carried a hidden meaning. The underlying message was, Charles is too capable, the council is worried about losing control. Letting him command an army of 20,000 would be sufficient. Having over 200,000 under his command would cause the council considerable anxiety. Now that the mutiny at the front is under control, it's time to remove Charles from his position as army commander. Having long been a political veteran, Foch naturally understood the underlying meaning. He hesitated briefly, feigning thought, before replying, "Your Excellency, I believe the key issue isn't whether Charles H. can support command at the army group level, but rather his good reputation. He has just won a victory, a glorious victory. This is crucial for stabilizing morale at the front, especially now. We cannot be hasty." This was a reminder to Clemenceau, even after using someone, don't be too hasty in dismantling them. The mutiny at the front has only just begun to subside. To discard them now might provoke a backlash. Clemenceau nodded slightly. This was also his concern. He took a sip of coffee, his brow furrowed but his tone remaining calm. "I've also heard that soldiers from other units have voluntarily joined the 6th Army at the Somme. We commend the soldiers for their bravery, but we must also understand that soldiers must remain at their posts, otherwise, gaps in the defenses are inevitable." His concern wasn't about the 6th Army itself, nor about gaps in the defenses, but rather the increasing number of soldiers gathering under Charles's command, bolstering his strength. This was almost unavoidable. If the 6th Army continued fighting at the Somme and Charles maintained low casualties, he would continuously build up his forces. Of course, Your Excellency, Foch said confidently. I will handle this. He paused, then added, perhaps transferring the 6th Army to Belgium would be a better option. As he spoke, Foch carefully observed Clemenceau's reaction. Clemenceau hummed in agreement. It was indeed a good idea. Belgium was relatively isolated compared to other defense lines, as it was mostly surrounded by Belgian civilians and British troops. It can be considered. Clemenceau nodded slowly. Foch's lips twitched. These guys, who only knew how to give orders from their offices, didn't understand military operations. They only thought about how to prevent the Charles's army from growing, but they didn't realize that Foch's move was actually merging the Charles's two forces into one. This actually consolidated the Charles's Mountai position in Belgium, a position that even the British couldn't shake. Clemenceau obviously hadn't considered this point. Perhaps Belgium was insignificant in his eyes, and of course he didn't think that Charles could cause any trouble there. Clemenceau was even quite satisfied with Foch's idea. A hint of approval appeared in his eyes. It seemed he hadn't chosen the wrong person. Foch would be a formidable opponent for the Charles. There's another issue. Clemenceau put his coffee cup on the table. We hope that after you take office, you can put a thorough end to the mutiny. Parliament doesn't want to see similar things happen again. Another meaning of mutiny is that the lower-class soldiers and civilians coerce Parliament's decisions, which Parliament doesn't want to see. It would shake the control of the parliamentarians and nobles over the country. I understand, Your Excellency, Foch replied. At the same time, he sighed inwardly, knowing that Parliament was eager to purge the mutiny, which would stir up another storm in the army. Chapter 565 The British First. Charles handed over command of the 6th Army to Christine, intending to dry his clothes and return to Paris for his vacation. But this delay was followed by a telegram from Pétain. Unbelievable. Foch has become commander-in-chief. He's actually become commander-in-chief. The facts have proven his offensive theories wrong, absolutely wrong. The army has suffered heavy casualties under these unrealistic operational theories, yet they chose him as commander-in-chief. Compared to your achievements, his merits are insignificant, especially your recent victory at the Somme. Yet they still made this decision. Charles saw anger and a hint of sowing discord in the telegram. Pétain hoped Charles would challenge Foch. Charles, of course, wouldn't fall for it. He replied, I'm also surprised, General. I've always believed you were the most suitable candidate for commander-in-chief, and I still do. While I have some achievements, as others have said, my age is a problem. I need more experience, and more importantly, I can't completely sever ties with capitalists. To be honest, I'd rather give up my military identity and be a pure businessman. Sometimes I don't even understand what I'm doing, or why I'm doing it. I could be lying in my warm home enjoying life. Why am I rolling around in this muddy and dangerous battlefield? I also feel that your contributions at Verdun are undeserved, General. You could say you saved France. Charles's words sounded like a complaint, but they were actually sending a message to Pétain. I'm not interested in being commander-in-chief, and I know Parliament won't elect me. You're different. You have the Verdun record, which can be said to have saved France at a crucial moment. How could they not choose you? As a result, Pétain's attempt to sow discord between Charles and Foch failed, and he was instead driven to the opposite end by Charles. When he received the telegram, he angrily slammed his coffee cup on the table, splashing coffee everywhere and even staining the documents. The staff officer rushed to clean it up. Pétain walked to the observation window, gazing at the distant German lines, and muttered, while we were fighting the Germans, Foch was in his warm office, smoking a cigar by the fire, doing nothing but criticizing Charles, and then he became commander-in-chief. Perhaps blinded by anger, he didn't connect criticizing Charles with becoming commander-in-chief, otherwise, he might have been able to understand the relationship between the three. Precisely because Pétain failed to understand, a rather surreal situation arose. Pétain and Foch were rivals, yet they were also allies of Charles. As dusk deepened, Charles's convoy braved the rain on the bumpy roads. That was Charles's communications platoon and guard platoon, a total of 3 cars and 1 vehicle, heading to the train station. Perhaps flying would have been faster to Paris, but at this time the planes were open tops, and with winter and rain, flying was hardly a pleasant experience. Charles suspected he would freeze to death before even reaching Paris. However, Charles hadn't anticipated that traveling by train, especially a wartime train, would be just as difficult. The train station was located in the town of Saint-Seine, 15 kilometers from the front lines, a distance that ensured the German 105mm artillery couldn't reach the station to destroy warehouses and supplies. It also served as a transit point. Supplies and reinforcements were transported here before being transferred to the front, and wounded soldiers brought down from the front awaiting repatriation also gathered here. When Charles's convoy entered the town, all he saw were wounded soldiers, both seriously and lightly wounded. Most of them used only a raincoat to shield themselves from the rain, some huddled under the eaves, shivering in the cold wind, clutching their raincoats, while others leaned against walls, motionless, their condition unknown, whether dead or asleep. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers dragged their weary bodies back and forth in the rain, many so exhausted they dragged their legs like zombies, yet the sheer number of patients kept them overwhelmed. The wounded gazed pitifully at the convoy heading to the train station in the middle of the road, seemingly hoping for a ride. Charles sighed inwardly. These were likely wounded soldiers stranded during Niveler's tenure, the casualties so great that they hadn't yet been transported back. However, Charles didn't know this was only one reason. The closer they got to the train station, the more wounded they became, until the station entrance was completely blocked, requiring heavily armed troops to maintain order and barely clear a path for the convoy. Charles noticed something unusual. "Why are the guards and order keepers all British soldiers?" Charles asked. Although the light was poor, the British soldiers' cap helmets were easily distinguishable. "If I didn't know this was the Somme, I would have thought I was in England. I'm not sure, General," the orderly Adrian replied. "It might be related to the British being in charge of supply transport," Charles said. "Oh, this guess was reasonable." At this time, the French army relied mainly on the British for supplies, especially since Nivelle was half British, so he would naturally grant certain privileges to the British. But soon, Charles realized that Nivelle had granted the British more than just certain privileges. The convoy moved along the passageway and finally stopped in front of the train. A British captain shone a flashlight on the pass Adrian handed him, then casually ran the flashlight over the guard, arrogantly handed the pass back, and impatiently waved his hand, shouting, "Carriage 5, hurry up." Adrian frowned. This guy was actually using such a tone and attitude towards Charles? The guards were also glaring angrily. If Charles hadn't intervened, they would have immediately given the man a few shots with their rifle butts. Charles didn't intend to cause any trouble. Maintaining order was perfectly acceptable. Disorder at the train station could delay traffic or even cause congestion, which was no small matter for the front lines. However, as Charles found carriage number 5 and was about to board, he suddenly noticed a strange phenomenon. He abruptly turned around, looking around in confusion, having already stepped into the carriage with one foot. "What's wrong, General?" Adrian, who was following behind, stopped. Charles asked, "Have you noticed that we're surrounded by wounded British soldiers?" Adrian looked to both sides and guessed, this train might be specifically for transporting wounded British soldiers. Charles shook his head, his gaze gradually turning cold. "But those waiting outside are all wounded French soldiers." Charles understood. The British, using their resources and control over their puppets, had exercised the right to prioritize the transport of the wounded. Chapter 566. Only Charles could do that. Charles first approached not the English, but the station master, a Frenchman named Donati. Charles considered the British to be not of our kind, believing in the law of the jungle. They would take advantage of any opportunity, and even more despicable were the French who betrayed their country's interests. However, Donati's answer prevented Charles from feeling any hatred. Looking at the menacing guards, and knowing that the major general before him was the renowned Charles, Donati trembled with fear. "General," Donati replied in a trembling voice, please believe me, I don't want to do this either. But it's an order from above. If I don't obey, I will immediately lose this hard-won job." Donati's eyes were full of pleading, as if saying, "Why should the struggles between the powerful affect us insignificant figures? A mere innocent bystander could leave my entire family starving." Charles was speechless. It was Nivelle's problem. He was a pro-British, even half-English. Although he has stepped down, Foch has not yet taken over, and there is currently a power vacuum. At this moment, the British captain, perhaps noticing the commotion, strode forward with several guards, arrogantly demanding, "What happened? Why aren't you on the vehicles?" Charles didn't answer, staring at the captain and coldly retorting, "Since when have you had priority?" The captain shone his flashlight, finally recognizing a major general before him. His arrogance subsided somewhat, but he still maintained a repulsive gentlemanly demeanor, answering with his chest puffed out, "I don't quite remember, General, probably since the day of the attack." He then countered, his tone aggressive, "Isn't this what's expected? We're here to help you fight, otherwise the Germans would have reached Paris long ago. We've made enormous sacrifices for France, General. Tens of thousands of British soldiers are dying every day. We just hope to treat these wounded as quickly as possible." I don't see anything unreasonable about that, Charles. Had never imagined such a statement. Britain was fighting for France? Britain's entry into the war wasn't because of France. It declared war when Germany attacked Belgium, and even before that, Britain had been engaged in naval competition with Germany. Did they think that fighting for France simply because the battlefield was in France meant they were fighting for France? Furthermore, Britain even attempted to infiltrate and control France, and they called this helping? "Captain," Charles interrupted the British captain, his voice calm and gentlemanly, "if you think you're fighting for France, why don't you withdraw your troops and withdraw from the war?" The British captain was taken aback. He hadn't expected Charles's response. "I hope you understand one thing," Charles said sarcastically, "if Britain was forced to enter the war for its own interests, then it's not helping. Besides, the British have set a record of 100,000 casualties in a single day, forcing us to deal with a massive number of corpses. You owe us a thank you." The guards chuckled. The fact that the British suffered 100,000 casualties a day and attempted to conceal the truth had long been a scandal for the British Army, especially for Haig. The British captain, pale with anger, could no longer maintain his feigned politeness and retorted sharply, "I also hope you understand, General, many of France's supplies were provided by Britain, including medicines and medical equipment, so," Charles countered, "weren't these supplies obtained by France with money and blood?" The British captain was speechless. The supplies provided by Britain were indeed purchased by France, not provided as free aid. Some were even high-interest loans. As for the blood, he knew it referred to the large number of wounded French soldiers stranded there. Charles didn't want to waste words with a British captain. He directly ordered, "It's been almost a month since the start of the war, and you've enjoyed priority transport for a month. From now until next month, it will be the priority transport period for wounded French soldiers." "No, you can't do that." The British captain took a step forward, his right hand unconsciously resting on the revolver at his waist. But before he could move further, the guards sprang into action, several rifles immediately pointed at him. "Captain," Station Chief Donady whispered tremblingly, "he's Charles. There's nothing he can't do. This insolent fellow, if he dared to fire a shot at Charles, we'd be devoured alive by the angry mob." The British captain looked up abruptly, as if struck by lightning. This young Major General was Charles? The Charles known as French Mars, the one who had just defeated the Germans at the Somme and advanced 5 kilometers? He'd thought he was some nobleman's son who'd infiltrated the army to experience life on the battlefield. Meanwhile, news of the situation had spread rapidly beyond the train station, growing increasingly outlandish. "Did you know? Charles got into a fight with the British at the station over the transport of wounded soldiers." "What? Charles fought with the British over wounded soldiers? Are you telling the truth?" The British were going to shoot Charles. French soldiers quickly sprang into action. Staff, wounded soldiers, and townspeople who had rushed to the scene, anyone still able-bodied, were mobilized. Even nurses and doctors joined in, grabbing pistols from the soldiers and storming into the train station, shouting and cursing, surrounding all the British. "You bastards, this is France, stay away from Charles, or I'll make you regret it, get out of here. France doesn't welcome bastards like you." The crowd, armed with weapons, pushed and shoved menacingly forward, some even physically provoking the British soldiers, waiting for them to retaliate. The British soldiers, pale with fear, retreated step by step. Several couldn't help but look back at the British captain, hoping he would realize the situation. Charles raised his hand in time to stop the crowd from moving further. He glanced at the British captain, then raised his head and shouted to the crowd, "I have just reached an agreement with the British. Due to the fact that more French wounded soldiers are stranded, the period from now until next month will be the priority for transporting French wounded soldiers. Both sides believe this is reasonable." As he spoke, Charles turned his gaze to the British captain and asked meaningfully, "Am I right, Captain?" The British captain's face was grim, but he still reluctantly nodded. "Yes, General, I completely agree." A cheer erupted at the train station. The wounded soldiers wept with joy, vying to spread the good news. This was an advantage that Charles had secured for them. Only Charles cared about them, and only Charles could do what he did, win back time, lives, and dignity from the arrogant British. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 567 Telepathy. In the small town of Lavas, Camille had been restless and unable to eat or sleep lately. Although good news of Charles's victories was everywhere, and she had seen related news in the newspapers, she even exclaimed like her neighbors, "How did he come up with the idea of using the Somme River to outflank the Germans?" Camille wasn't interested in such things, as always. But anything related to Charles made her want to know, as if a magic pulled her to understand, as if only in this way could she find peace of mind. However, the reality was quite the opposite. The more she knew, the more anxious she became. "God, that's the Somme," Camille complained to Joka. "How could they send Charles to a place like that? Charles has been in Belgium the whole time, he just finished a battle. I heard the British lost 100,000 men that day, and the French suffered 40,000 casualties. It's too dangerous there. They can't rely on Charles to solve everything, he's only 18, Joka looked at Camille incredulously. "But we all know Charles defeated the Germans there." "He's won, Camille, that's now," Camille retorted. "The Battle of the Somme isn't completely over yet, is it? So the danger still exists." Joka was speechless. Camille's words seemed to make sense. But then he thought, as long as Charles was in the army, as long as the war continued, the danger would always exist, regardless of whether Charles was on the Somme or not. However, Joka didn't say anything. He understood that a mother worried about her child would never let go of her anxiety unless Charles was standing in front of her. Around 4 in the morning, a blurry car headlight flashed across the dark town, and a few barks could be faintly heard amidst the rain. Camille suddenly woke up, sitting up abruptly in bed, listening intently to the sounds outside the window. "What's going on?" Joka, awakened by the noise, rolled over and asked groggily. "Someone's coming," Camille replied. "It's a car, come on, Camille," Joka couldn't help but complain. "You're too tense, a little neurotic," but the next second, the noise of a car engine rose from downstairs. Camille quickly got up and stood by the window, pulling back a corner of the curtains. Joka sighed, rubbing his head. "Do you have to get up and check every car that passes by? That can't be Charles, Camille. He's still on the Somme, commanding the 6th Army, over 200,000 men. He can't just abandon his troops and come back anytime." But Camille exclaimed, "Laurent's car. It's Charles. Joka, it's Charles." She excitedly rushed downstairs, then frantically ran back to grab an umbrella before dashing off again, leaving a series of hurried thumps in the wooden stairwell. Joka couldn't believe it. Was this some kind of telepathy? Could Camille sense Charles? He got up, half believing, and went to the window, just in time to see Camille in her pajamas, holding an umbrella, welcoming Charles out of the car. She was right. Joka shrugged, he could only accept it. Charles returned without even showering, only briefly chatting with Joka and Camille before collapsing onto the bed and falling asleep. He had slept for several hours on the train, but for some reason, train sleep always left him feeling exhausted despite being asleep. However, it was still much better than sleeping in the trenches. It wasn't until after 5 p.m. the next day that Charles groggily woke up. He looked around his room and found the familiar yet unfamiliar environment very clean, while he himself stood out awkwardly, covered in mud from his trousers and cuffs, stiffened from drying. Charles spent some time showering and changing into clean clothes, realizing he was so hungry his legs felt weak. He realized he hadn't eaten or drunk anything for over 20 hours, and he had a headache and a stuffy nose, feeling like he was catching a cold. Charles frowned. Perhaps the physical exhaustion from the battlefield had made him unusually vulnerable once he returned to a comfortable environment and relaxed. Going downstairs, Charles was surprised to see Djokovic and Camille there, sitting on the sofa, quietly discussing something. Seeing Charles come down, Camille stood up and gave him a hug, then affectionately patted Charles's still damp hair. "Hungry? Dinner is ready. I heard you have a week's vacation." Joka got up and sat down at the table. "Yes," Charles sat down as well, "but a day has already passed. Many people are curious about your battle on the Somme." Joka smiled with pride, They never expected you to use the Navy's landing craft in amphibious assault ships on the Somme. Camille brought out a steaming apple pizza, carefully cutting it with a knife. The key is the Somme. Everyone was wondering how our Charles would break through the Germans' impenetrable defenses, but he used the river. She handed Charles a slice of pizza. Charles glanced at Camille in surprise as he took the pizza. This didn't seem like something she would say. Joka understood Charles's expression. He smiled and said, "Don't doubt it, Camille has been reading the newspapers and has learned quite a bit about military matters." "How did you come up with that?" Camille asked, her eyes shining. She realized she admired her son the most. Charles, chewing his food, mumbled, "It's actually very simple. If we can't think of a suitable method, there might only be one outcome." Charles suddenly realized he'd let something slip and quickly stopped himself, stealing a glance at Camille. He paused, then tried to cover for himself. "I mean, it could cause a lot of casualties. To avoid that, I can only do everything I can." Camille sat back in her chair and nodded slightly in understanding. She pretended not to understand and tried to maintain a smile, but there was a hint of heaviness in her smile. Joka changed the subject, asking Charles, "When you came back last time, we seemed to have made an agreement, did we?" Charles feigned ignorance. He actually remembered Camille's instructions. "You must bring her next time you come." "I know her name is Lucia." Camille raised an eyebrow, picked up a slice of pizza and ate it leisurely, feigning indifference. "I know she works at the officers' club. Do you think she'd be willing if we had Major Laurent pick her up?" "No, Mother." Charles was getting anxious. Joka chimed in. "Major Laurent said that if all else fails, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand could handle it." "Lieutenant Colonel Fernand knows her well, that bastard Laurent." Charles cursed inwardly. He knew that guy was unreliable. "You choose one." Camille stared at Charles. "Are you going to talk to her or?" "I'll talk to her," Charles answered desperately. What else could he do? Chapter 568. This is not a trap. Inside the officers' club at the Paris City Defense Headquarters, glasses clinked and laughter filled the air. Officers talked animatedly under the dim lights, occasionally raising their glasses and shouting, "Long live France!" Those around them echoed, "Long live France!" Garrel, serving drinks to customers and returning with a tray, said to Lucia, who was busy behind the bar, "I heard Charles gone on vacation. When you see him, please give him my thanks." What? Lucia, busy with her work, didn't understand why Garrel wanted to thank Charles. Garrel glanced around the club, saying with a touch of melancholy, "Can't you see? The reason we weren't fired is because of Charles." Lucia still didn't understand. She pushed the mixed drinks towards the customers, turning to Garrel with a puzzled look. "Please, Lucia," Garrel explained, "you know it's a time of scarcity. Many clubs have already closed down. Indeed, fewer and fewer people could afford to drink, causing many bars to close. The officers' club still had so many customers because Charles was a regular. The officers felt it was more meaningful to discuss Charles's achievements there, as if Charles were giving them pointers. So, it seemed to indeed be related to Charles. However, Lucia smoothed her hair, put on a smug look, and leaned forward. "Garrel, perhaps you should thank someone else more." "Oh," Garrel exaggeratedly curled her lips, then, realizing what she meant, tossed her hair in a flamboyant manner. "That's not necessarily true, Lucia. Charles is coming here isn't necessarily for you. Get lost." Lucia grabbed a rag and threw it at her, and the two burst into laughter. Suddenly, Garrel stopped laughing and whispered to Lucia with a teasing look, "Do you need me to seduce him?" She gestured towards the door with her chin. Lucia turned her head and saw Charles in military uniform walking towards her with his head down, as if he was thinking about something. Lucia glared at Garrel, about to grab her, but she smiled and nimbly ran away. "A cup of coffee," Charles said, but immediately changed his mind. "No, a glass of water, please." "Okay," Lucia replied. At that moment, the officers saw Charles and cheered. "Look, the general is here." "How lucky, it's a pleasure to see you, General. A brilliant victory. You defeated the Germans cleanly and decisively." Someone raised their glass and shouted, "Gentlemen, a toast to the greatest general of France." "Cheers, cheers, to the general." Charles took the water from Lucia, smiled, and turned to wave it at the officers, which drew another round of cheers. A few oblivious officers seemed to want to ingratiate themselves with Charles, but were immediately pulled back. "Damn it, the general has limited time. The general isn't here to see you. You shouldn't bother him at this time." Charles ignored them. He found an empty seat, took out the handkerchief Camille had prepared for him, wiped his stuffy nose, and coughed a few times. "What's wrong?" Lucia sat opposite Charles with a glass of water, her eyes full of concern. "It's nothing," Charles replied. "I'm probably just chilled." Charles was reluctant to elaborate on the matter. He glanced around, leaned closer, and asked in a low voice, "Do you have information on American merchant ships traveling to Britain?" Lucia nodded confidently. "We have people working on them." "Very good." Charles nodded and whispered in Lucia's ear. "Whether you can leak some of the information to the Germans, depending on the situation." Lucia didn't think much of it and readily agreed. "No problem." This surprised Charles. He had expected Lucia to at least ask a question, since leaking merchant ship information to Germany was, to put it bluntly, collusion. But Lucia not only didn't ask, she didn't even hesitate. Lucia seemed to understand Charles's expression. She smiled slightly and explained softly, "I know your echo detector has already been equipped by the Navy and is currently undergoing intensive testing." Charles hummed in agreement. The lady in white was quite capable. She actually knew about the echo detector, a highly classified military secret under the tight protection of the British and French navies. However, on the other hand, with the echo detector installed, tested, and trained at the shipyard, many people must know about it, making secrecy unrealistic. So, Charles didn't quite understand the connection between the two. "It's a trap, isn't it?" Lucia breathed softly into Charles's ear, seemingly praising him. "Leak the intelligence to the Germans, let their submarines attack, that's how you hunt them down more effectively." "You're very clever." Charles's expression was somewhat strange, and he hesitated for a moment before answering, "Yes, you're right, I knew it." Lucia's eyes held a hint of smugness. "That's the best way to understand it," Charles thought. This wasn't actually a trap. Charles was thinking of the train station incident. At that time, France even needed to import ammunition from the United States through Britain. If this situation didn't change, the British could always control the French army through supplies, achieving a certain privilege. Even Commander-in-Chief Foch had to bow down to the British. To break this status quo, the German submarines had to play a role, and a crucial one at that. Only when the German submarines were effective would France's echo detector be indispensable. This was the only way to curb the British privileges. Therefore, Charles revealing merchant ship information to the Germans wasn't a trap, but purely a scheme to trap the British. But who knew? Ultimately, the French fleet would indeed arrive with echo detectors to prove their worth, so let's just consider it a trap. Then Charles hesitated. "There's something else." "What?" Lucia was puzzled. This was the first time Charles had shown such difficulty. "It's like this," Charles said. "My parents want to see you." Lucia looked confused. "See me?" Lucia didn't understand why Charles's parents wanted to see her. But she understood the next second. She looked at Charles with shock, a hint of joy in her eyes. "You mean, they know I exist?" "Yes," Charles said, his tone helpless. "They want to have dinner with you tomorrow night at my house." Seeing Lucia's stunned expression, Charles added, "If you don't want to, I can turn them down." "No, I'm willing." Lucia unconsciously grasped Charles's hand, then quickly released it, realizing her mistake. "I'm just a little nervous. Because I don't know what they like, or what gift to bring them." She looked at Charles with pleading eyes. This stumped Charles. He suddenly realized he had never considered what Joka and Camille liked. Chapter 569 Battle Giants. "Buy whatever you like," Charles said. "They won't mind." Charles felt ashamed. He had always taken Joka and Camille's care for granted without ever reciprocating. Lucia seemed to understand something. She didn't press further but instead glanced at Charles and asked, "One last question, is this chores or a task?" Charles hesitated for a moment before answering, "You can treat it as a task." He was doing this to avoid arousing suspicion, so it was a task, Charles thought. That made sense. What Charles didn't notice was the fleeting hint of loneliness and disappointment in Lucia's eyes. She hoped Charles would answer that it was chores. He had already met the girl's parents, so now he should meet the boy's parents. Charles was very busy this holiday. He hadn't been to the factory in a long time. After a quick breakfast the next morning, Charles and Joka went to the tractor factory together. Charles went to the research and development department. As soon as he entered the gate, he found Matthew discussing something with a technician. Matthew, now sporting a prosthetic leg, looked like a one-legged pirate. His bushy beard made him appear much more mature, and his unkempt hair resembled a bird's nest. He also wore glasses. Matthew saw Charles, removed his glasses, and limped over, laughing heartily as he gave Charles a hug. "Look at you," Matthew said, taking a step back and scrutinizing Charles. A general who defeated the Germans time and time again, truly remarkable. People are everywhere praising your achievements. I can hardly believe they're talking about you. Charles nodded at the glasses in Matthew's hand. When did you become nearsighted? Matthew shrugged indifferently. It's the price of developing tanks. Later, Charles learned that Matthew had been studying and researching engine technology day and night, sometimes staying at the factory overnight. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say he was working tirelessly. It was hard to imagine that someone who used to get a headache just looking at books in school had now become a research and development talent. You've come at the right time. Matthew beckoned to Charles and led him to a desk. Looking at the spread-out blueprints, he said, "These are my designs for a new tank. See if they satisfy you." Charles leaned closer to look and saw it was the Char 2C tank. The image above shows the French Char 2C super heavy tank, developed in 1921, powered by two 250 horsepower engines, 10.27 meters long, with twin turrets. Charles frowned and asked Matthew, "Why did you come up with the idea to design such a tank?" Matthew replied, "I wanted to produce an invincible tank, one that could destroy everything on the battlefield, and whose armor nothing could penetrate." Then, he gestured excitedly as he described the tank's specifications. "I plan to equip it with a 75mm gun, 45mm frontal armor. We've tested it. This thickness of armor can withstand a German 77mm infantry gun." "Matthew," Charles interrupted him, "this isn't suitable." "Why?" Matthew asked, his face filled with disappointment. He couldn't believe his efforts had been rejected by Charles at a glance. "No tank is invincible. This kind of tank doesn't exist," Charles replied. "How will you know if you don't try?" Matthew persisted. "Let me put it this way," Charles answered, "its weight is one of the problems. The calculation shows 40 tons. Matthew rummaged on the table, pulling out a sheet of paper filled with data from scattered documents and handing it to Charles. "Two engines can easily power it, and it can maintain a speed similar to the Char A1, powerful firepower, thick armor, plus speed." Matthew couldn't understand why it wouldn't be suitable. However, Charles knew that such a super heavy tank was an ideal. Imagination is always beautiful, but reality is cruel. The Char 2C increased from the initial 40 tons to 70 tons through continuous improvements. The Tiger tank of World War II only weighed 56 tons, and even with a 650 horsepower engine, it was still a logistical nightmare. The Char 2C, however, used engines from World War I, weighing 70 tons and powered by two 250 horsepower engines totaling 500 horsepower. This wasn't a nightmare, it was a pipe dream. "Or we can think of it this way," Charles said. "Try running a 40-ton load on two 250 horsepower engines and see how long it can run normally." Matthew seemed to understand. "Are you worried about its reliability?" "You could say that," Charles nodded. "Two engines mean twice the failure rate." "Matthew, this is different from airplanes, where twin engines improve safety. If one engine fails, the other can still keep the aircraft flying, only at the cost of speed and performance. Tanks are completely different. If either of their two engines fails, the tank will be unable to move forward." Matthew considered for a moment and slowly nodded. "Such large equipment as tanks is almost impossible to repair on the battlefield. Once it malfunctions, it's practically scrapped." Charles hummed in agreement. This was the fate of the Charles 2C in actual combat. They weren't destroyed by the enemy, but rather, because they were too cumbersome or malfunctioned to be carried away, the French army, not wanting to be used by the enemy, had to destroy them themselves. Then Charles offered a feasible solution. He picked up a pencil and began sketching, making cuts and additions as he spoke. Single turret, single engine, reduced overall size and weight. The image above shows the Charles B-1 heavy tank, used by the French Army in 1931. It had a single 250 horsepower engine, weighed 31.5 tons, and was known as the Battle Giant due to its outstanding performance in World War II. Matthew stared wide-eyed at the tank's design. "It actually has two cannons? You added two cannons to this little tank." But he then raised a question: isn't the 75mm cannon on the hull too limited in its freedom of movement? "Its firing angle is very limited." "That's not a problem," Charles replied. "We can use it to attack enemy bunkers or the frontal armor of tanks. If the task is to attack the front, less freedom of movement is needed." Matthew looked at the sketch thoughtfully. The turret mounting a small caliber cannon allowed for a smaller turret, while the gun barrel mounting a large caliber cannon increased firepower. The two complemented each other, ultimately achieving an overall increase in firepower. Then, comparing it to his own design, he exclaimed in surprise, "My God, its firepower isn't even that much worse than mine, but it's much lighter and smaller. And because it uses a single engine, the cost and failure rate will be reduced." Matthew looked at Charles in disbelief. "I'm starting to envy you, Charles. You've surpassed all my efforts with just a casual sketch." Charles smiled slightly. This wasn't just a casual sketch. It was the improvement the French army achieved in tank development over the next decade or so. Chapter 570 The Inventor of the Mortar. Just as Charles and Matthew were discussing the details further, a secretary entered the R&D department and approached Charles. "General, Mr. Dejoko requests your presence in his office. Someone wishes to see you." "Yes, sir," Charles replied. "I'll be right there." At the same time, he wondered who had such influence that they would go through Dejoko to request a meeting. A friend? A reporter? Or someone else? Charles didn't dwell on it, gave Matthew a few instructions, and followed the secretary to the office building. Entering the office, Charles saw a middle-aged man in his 50s, wearing a suit and tie, who appeared to be wealthy. The man was talking to Dejoko, and upon seeing Charles in his military uniform, he quickly stood up to greet him, his voice excited. You must be General Charles? It's an honor to meet you, General." Charles cast a questioning glance at Dejoko. Dejoko stood up and introduced, "This is Mr. Stokes, the owner of Scott Machinery Company in England. Most of the parts for our tractors are supplied by his company, so they were business partners." Charles maintained a smile and shook hands with Stokes. "It's an honor for me, Mr. Stokes." Charles vaguely felt the name was familiar, as if he'd heard it somewhere before. The group sat back down on the sofa, and Dejoko picked up a sketch from the coffee table, waved it at Charles, and said with a smile, "Can you believe it? Stokes had the same idea as you. He also designed a mortar, but you beat him to it." Charles was taken aback, took the sketch, and saw that it was indeed a mortar. The next second, Charles thought, "Stokes? The guy who actually invented the mortar." The image above shows Stokes, the head of a mechanical company. He knew nothing about artillery, but after hearing from a reporter that the army lacked indirect fire guns, he spent several months inventing a mortar. He was 55 years old at the time mentioned in the text. The image above shows Stokes testing his invented mortar. "This is what I designed last year," Stokes said nervously. "Unfortunately, I made some mistakes. Because of my lack of knowledge about military equipment, I used powdered black powder to make the propellant. Later I learned that I should use granulated black powder. When I successfully tested it and showed my invention to the military, guess what they said? Note, powdered black powder causes the gunpowder to clump together, and due to lack of oxygen during ignition, it cannot burn completely, resulting in a situation similar to the continuous burning of solid propellant. Granulated black powder, on the other hand, has gaps between the particles, ensuring an instantaneous burst of powerful force upon ignition." Stokes shook his head, looking at Charles with disbelief. "This is what they told me." "Sorry, Stokes, Charles got there before you. His mortars have been in use on the battlefield for some time now. Haven't you heard? He even won a victory with mortars." "Unbelievable, such a coincidence." Then, Stokes added somewhat awkwardly, "But please don't misunderstand, I didn't mean to compete with you for industrial rights. You have absolute ownership, that's beyond question. Your mortars were earlier and more advanced than mine, please believe me. I just wanted to express my ganke, a feeling of deep emotion or reflection." Charles nodded. "I believe you, Mr. Stokes." Charles felt a little guilty. He turned his gaze to the blueprints in his hand and sincerely praised, "A wonderful idea. I believe if you knew more about military matters, or if you were a soldier, you might have invented it even earlier than me." Stokes breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing Charles's words. "Thank you very much, General. Thank you for your trust and recognition." Charles didn't answer, but instead asked, "Why don't we cooperate, Mr. Stokes?" "What?" Stokes was taken aback. "What do you mean, tractors? They're already partners. Mortars? Charles's mortars are mature enough, there's no need for cooperation." "Artillery," Charles said, shaking the blueprints in his hand. "You have research on artillery, an interest in it, and more importantly, creativity. You know, this is wartime, and we desperately need talent like this." Charles's words made Stokes blush. "No, General, I think you've misunderstood. I'm not an artillery design expert. I could even say I know nothing about artillery. I'm just a mechanical designer. Although I'd love to work with you, but," Charles interrupted Stokes, "I know, Mr. Stokes. But many things in artillery require more mechanical knowledge than artillery knowledge. It's essentially a machine, Stokes agreed, but still didn't quite understand. For example, he hoped Charles could give an example, showing him where he could contribute. For example, we need to shorten the breech block, Charles replied. Shorten a breech block? Stokes looked bewildered. The military had this requirement? Yes, Charles explained calmly. Ordinary artillery might not have this need, but if we were to fit this cannon into a tank turret, Stokes exclaimed in sudden realization, then his eyes lit up instantly. You're right, General, that's definitely something we can do. God, this will be a great invention. All tanks will have similar needs. Its prospects are unimaginable. My God, we're going to be rich. Excellent project, General. This is fantastic. Charles proposed the Charles B-1 because of the breech block problem. At that time, there were no dedicated tank guns, and the excessively long breech block prevented large caliber cannons from fitting into the turret. If a large caliber cannon had to be used, an enormous turret would be required. And to power this turret, even greater power was needed, plus the turret required thick armor, so 2 engines were needed. Then, like adding more water to flour, and more flour to water, the super-heavy tank Charles II-C was finally born. The only solution was to mount the large caliber gun inside the hull, like the Charles B-1. While this sacrificed some freedom in gun design, it solved the problem of having or not having a gun. So, Charles asked, "You agree?" Of course. Stokes nodded emphatically, rose, and shook hands with Charles. Of course I agree, General. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. The 2 images above show the breech block moving up and down. This is a modified tank gun with a shortened breech block. During World War I, because there were no dedicated tank guns, the only options were either a rotating turret with a small caliber gun or a turretless tank using a large caliber gun. The Charles B-1's layout was the best choice to ensure firepower without a dedicated tank gun. Chapter 571 America is a big piece of fat meat. Stokes left satisfied, even though Charles had set a series of harsh conditions in the cooperation agreement. For example, a factory had to be set up in Lavas for renovations, relevant personnel had to be trained for the tractor factory, and cooperation with Britain could only begin after 3 years. Stokes readily agreed to all of them, understanding that Charles was wary of Britain, not Scott machinery. More importantly, he knew that Charles was irreplaceable, while machinery companies were replaceable. If Stokes disagreed with these conditions and chose not to cooperate, hundreds or even thousands of machinery companies would immediately line up to cooperate with Charles. Stokes even believed that Charles didn't need to choose a British machinery company to cooperate with. A domestic machinery company would be much safer. This was indeed true, but not entirely. Charles had a compensatory mentality. He had appropriated Stokes's invention of the mortar, giving him a tank gun idea in return. But this was only part of the story. I'm not sure if this is feasible, Joka said, looking at the cooperation agreement with some concern. Scott Machinery is, after all, a British company. Charles, once there's a conflict of national interests, no agreement will work. It was clear that in the face of national interests, agreements between companies were just a piece of paper. But Charles wasn't worried. French mechanical companies are perhaps less reliable, father, Charles replied, because they are mostly associated with Schneider. He then added, if Stokes is smart enough, he will try to protect our interests, not Britain's. Joka seemed to understand. Charles would have many more inventions to keep Stokes occupied. At the same time, Charles's real adversary was Schneider, not the British mechanical companies. From a personal perspective, the British mechanical companies were safer. However, wasn't this putting personal interests above national interests? Joka glanced at Charles. Charles said nothing. Some things were inexplicable. Historically, although Britain was the country that invented the tank, its island nation nature, emphasizing its navy and air force while neglecting its army, meant its tank development had always been misguided. From infantry tanks in World War II to the stubborn use of rifled cannons after the war, and finally having to switch to smooth-bore cannons, which were far behind the times. For a country whose development direction was always flawed, Charles wasn't worried about it becoming a competitor in tanks. He could cooperate with confidence. Joka, however, wasn't thinking about these things. He found a plausible excuse for Charles from another angle. Charles was the most conscientious capitalist. His interests represented the national interest. Yes, that must be it. Then, Joka seemed to remember something. He got up, went to his desk, took a document from a drawer, and handed it to Charles. Your decisions are all correct. Our insurance industry is developing very smoothly, both British and French. In just a few months, we've acquired over 100 insurance companies, 48 in Britain and 71 in France. Charles took the document and saw it contained data on insurance companies. He flipped to the back and looked at the final figures, almost being shocked. Even excluding the rapidly increasing francs and pounds, the amount of US dollars exchanged alone exceeded 120 million. Keep in mind that Britain only borrowed a little over 10 billion US dollars from the United States throughout World War I, which had already determined the course of the war, yet Charles alone possessed over 100 million US dollars in foreign exchange. This was the reward of the war. Charles marveled at how it could rapidly increase wealth exponentially. This is after we provided a large amount of supplies to the front lines. Joka raised an eyebrow. The 6th Army has over 200,000 men, and we spent over 30 million US dollars on it. Joka felt regretful about this. Although I know you save many people, this money shouldn't be borne by us. Joka meant that this could be reported to Congress for government reimbursement, since it was funds used to quell a mutiny. It was worth it, father, Charles replied, not intending to do so. All right, Joka nodded. What should we do next? Continue buying supplies. Charles casually flipped through the documents, then shook his head. No, I plan to develop the military industry in the United States. Develop the military industry in the United States. Joka, who was holding a cup of coffee, stopped what he was doing and looked at Charles in astonishment. You really plan to do that? Charles nodded slightly. In which area? Joka asked again. All of them, Charles replied. Light machine guns, submachine guns, rifles, grenades, helmets. Joka put down his coffee cup, his tone slightly tense. Have you considered whether the United States needs these things? I mean, the United States is a neutral country, and its current national policy is not to participate in wars. I think you must have heard of the Monroe Declaration. Note, the Monroe Declaration, issued in 1823, stated that the United States would remain neutral in disputes between European countries or wars between countries and their American colonies. Any such wars occurring in the Americas would be considered hostile acts by the United States. Yes, father, Charles closed the document. He found the data largely meaningless. What mattered was how to double it. Then you should understand that the United States will not go to war. Joka thought Charles's decision was wrong. The fact that the United States wouldn't go to war meant they didn't need those weapons, so developing a military industry in the United States would be pointless. The United States will go to war, Charles answered confidently, rising to hand the data back to Joka. In his eyes, the United States was a huge piece of meat. No one, including the United States itself, believed they would go to war, and therefore, they were almost unprepared for it. This resulted in a severe shortage of weapons and equipment when they entered the war. They wore cowboy hats, also known as Montana hats or lemon juicer hats, had no tanks or armored vehicles, and needed machine guns supplied by France, even the tattered Chauchat machine guns. Charles thought, why not intercept supplies in America? Sell the equipment to the Americans to make money, then use the American money to buy supplies and ship them to France. That way, they could completely break free from dependence on British supplies, including those for the First Lord of the Admiralty. All right, seeing Charles's insistence, Joka felt he should trust Charles's judgment. After all, Charles hadn't been wrong so far. So, who do you think we should send to America? Charles immediately gave a candidate. What do you think of Joseph? Joseph, Joka was taken aback. His loyalty is beyond question, but he doesn't know much about military affairs. Joseph was Matthew's father, the Bernard family's most loyal butler, and had always been the factory manager of the tractor factory. He doesn't need to know about military affairs, father, Charles replied. He only needs to know how to manage and do business. How many people running arsenals and selling weapons in this era truly understood military affairs? Stead? Wells? It's still LeBron James. Chapter 572. This is your order. That day, Charles and Joka talked until very late before Joka went home. Joka had no objection to Joseph being chosen to go to the United States to develop the military industry. Joseph's abilities and loyalty had already been proven at the tractor factory. Joseph's strengths lay in his approachable and easygoing nature towards his subordinates. He managed the company very well, and, most notably, possessed excellent social skills. He always knew how to interact with different people and handle relationships effectively. The latter was perhaps a skill Joseph had cultivated over his years as a butler. It was said that he could discern a person's personality, temperament, and preferences at a glance. Joker's doubts, however, remained regarding the strategic direction of developing the military industry in the United States, even though he had decided to trust Charles. On the way home that evening, Charles had to let Joker know a little about it. "Father, you should know about Wilhelm II's recent proposal for peace negotiations, right?" "Yes." Joker pulled the windshield wipers off and glanced quickly at Charles sitting beside him. "But what does this have to do with the American military industry?" "There's a strong public demand for negotiations," Charles said, "but it was rejected by Parliament, and the same goes for Britain." Joker steered the car around the corner. "People are tired of this war, but Parliament thinks it's a delaying tactic by the Germans, not just a delaying tactic. But there was also a rumor that the Germans planned to negotiate with the Anglo-French forces so they could focus on attacking Russia, and then declare war on Britain and France after defeating Russia." "It was the Americans who did it," Charles replied calmly. "The Americans don't want this war to stop?" Joker was startled, his hand on the steering wheel trembled, and the car jolted slightly. "For the loan, Father," Charles explained, "only by utterly defeating the Germans and obtaining reparations can the Americans get that loan." Joker was silent for a moment, then nodded slightly. "So, the Americans are bound to go to war?" "Yes." Charles tightened his overcoat and replied, "The Americans won't let the Allies lose. Once Russia is defeated, or the scales of victory tip in Germany's favor, the Americans will definitely go to war." The American financial groups, when lobbying the U.S. president, said something like, "Mr. President, we all know that if this loan to Europe turns into a bad bet, even God will have to leave. Simply put, if they don't get the money, you can't be president. Angry people will oust you. So the U.S. president has no choice but to work with the financial groups to promote the necessity of going to war and then send American soldiers to the Western Front, which has nothing to do with them." Joker fell silent. He then realized that Charles saw things far more profoundly than he did. Charles could even predict the future based on the current situation, and it all seemed perfectly reasonable, as if he knew these things would happen. The car stopped at the front door, and Joker, holding an umbrella, helped Charles out. As they hurried inside, they were surprised to find Camille chatting happily with a woman. Charles recognized her as Lucia and suddenly remembered it was the day of the meeting the parents. Camille chided, "I told you to come back early. You must have forgotten." Lucia stepped forward and shook hands with Joker, introducing herself. "Hello, Uncle. My name is Lucia." "Hello." Joker glanced at Lucia, smiled, and nodded at Charles, seemingly praising his good taste. Camille brought out the prepared dinner from the kitchen, including turkey, smoked fish, and beef stew with white beans. As she served the dishes, Camille specifically said to Charles, "The beef stew with white beans was made by Lucia. Would you like to try some?" Charles felt a strange unease and unconsciously glanced at Lucia. That was a dish the former Charles used to like. How did she know? Charles didn't think much of it. Perhaps it was a coincidence, or perhaps Camille had prepared the dish and Lucia was just helping out. But what happened next made Charles increasingly uneasy. "See these earrings?" Camille tilted her head towards Joker as she sat down at the table, showing him the earrings on her earlobes. "They're almost identical to the ones I lost before." "Unbelievable." "Oh, right, Uncle." Lucia took a box from her bag and leaned across the table to hand it to Joker across the table. "This is a gift for you." "Thank you," Joker replied politely. He opened it and saw a pocket watch, looking at Lucia in surprise. "What a coincidence. You might not believe it, but my pocket watch broke a few days ago, and I was too busy with work to buy a new one. This is exactly what I need." "Is that so?" Lucia smiled in response. "That's quite a coincidence." Charles put down his knife and fork, which clattered on the plate. "What's wrong?" Camille looked at Charles with a puzzled expression. Joker also looked confused. Lucia seemed to sense something, her smile faltering for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "No, it's nothing," Charles said, trying to cover it up. "I'm just a little tired." Dinner was rather somber, or rather, Charles couldn't relate to it. Lucia, Joker, Camille, and the others were laughing and chatting. She seemed to know their personalities and preferences very well, even Charles's. However, Charles knew what that meant. The rain pattered, and a chilly wind blew. After dinner, Charles drove Lucia back to Paris. Neither of them spoke the entire way. Lucia sat in the passenger seat, gazing out the window at the rain, occasionally reaching out to catch a raindrop, humming a song softly. "You seem quite pleased with yourself," Charles asked coldly. "What?" Lucia retorted, without turning around. "Not satisfied with my performance today? You use the same tactics you use on the enemy on my family," Charles replied. Lucia was silent for a moment, then suddenly laughed, her voice cold. "You seem to have forgotten that this was your order, General." "My order?" Charles was taken aback. "Yes," Lucia replied. "Household chores or a mission?" "You chose the mission." Lucia turned to Charles. "Since it's a mission, don't you think I should have used some methods? For example, I should know what they like, only then can I guarantee their approval. Otherwise, doesn't that mean the mission has failed?" Charles was speechless. It seemed to be his oversight. He hadn't thought of that. "You're not allowed to inquire about their information from now on," Charles said. "Yes, General," Lucia replied, then continued humming her song. The song sounded light and melodious, yet it carried a strange sadness. Chapter 573. Charles is no lamb. Perhaps driven by the urgency of the war, or perhaps knowing that Charles also meant profit and wealth, Stokes set up a laboratory for developing a dedicated tank gun in just 2 days. He decided to shorten the breech block based on the French 75mm gun, and if possible, reduce weight and extend its service life. Matthew also put the Charles B-1 tank on the agenda. With the blueprints, an engine, and the foundation for tank production, using readily available artillery, it was almost like piecing together building blocks. Matthew estimated that a prototype of this new model could be produced and put into testing in 1 or 2 months. Joseph was sent to the United States to expand business. Joseph believed that with the help of FN, he was confident that he could quickly establish a foothold in the United States. But these were not the main points. Although FN cooperated with the Steed Arms factory and followed Charles' lead, this branch was far away in the United States, not in Belgium. Charles had absolute control in Belgium, and FN headquarters had no power to resist. They knew that obedience was the only way out. The situation was different for the American branch. Joseph's opening of an arms factory in the U.S. would even create competition, and the branch was only superficially helping Joseph under pressure from the head office. The truly crucial factor was that Charles contacted Colonel Johnson of the U.S. military, the head of the Tank Research Laboratory, who had previously purchased a production license for the Charles A-1 tank from Charles. Washington, D.C., USA, the Tank Research Laboratory located on the north bank of the Potomac River. The image above shows Washington, D.C., although named a laboratory, this laboratory was more like a military camp. Its gates were always tightly closed, surrounded by high walls and patrols. Inside, the rumbling sounds and shouts of soldiers could be heard intermittently. It was filled with barbed wire, trenches, and anti-tank ditches, resembling a small battlefield. Colonel Johnson was commanding the 1st U.S. Tank Regiment in a simulated attack on enemy positions. He frowned, constantly checking documents in his hand, occasionally yelling rudely at the American soldiers slacking off on the field, "Get your legs moving and keep up with the tanks, you bastards, or I'll shove the tank exhaust pipes into your asses." The staff officer, having put away his binoculars, reported helplessly, "Colonel, we can't get through the anti-tank ditch. I think buying bridging vehicles from the Shire is the only way." Colonel Johnson shook his head slightly. "You don't understand, Ryan. There's too much to buy. Almost everything needed to be purchased: armored reconnaissance vehicles, submachine guns, machine guns, even helmets. The U.S. had money, but the key was that there was no war pressure at the moment, and Congress wouldn't approve these funds. Even acquiring tank production licenses from the Shire had already taken the military a tremendous effort. What to do? Colonel Johnson looked at the soldiers who were joking about war and fell into deep despair. The soldiers had no idea of the cruelty of war. 100,000 casualties a day were just numbers to them, completely devoid of any real understanding. If these greenhorns were to go to the battlefield like this one day, they'd be so terrified they'd wet their pants. Just then, a communications soldier handed Colonel Johnson a telegram. "Colonel. A telegram from France. Charles says he's interested in opening an arms factory in America. Would we welcome that?" Colonel Johnson, who had been looking worriedly at the training ground, suddenly turned around. "What did you say?" Before the communications soldier could speak, he rushed forward, snatched the telegram from his hand, read it over and over to confirm it was correct, then took a few deep breaths, beaming with joy, and shouted excitedly, "Great! We're saved!" Colonel Johnson nervously pumped his fist. simultaneously shoving his hips forward a few times, then suddenly pointed at the communications soldier and ordered, "Reply immediately, we warmly welcome you. If you set up a factory in our country, the government and military will likely offer your company the most favorable policies." The communications soldier had just turned to leave when Colonel Johnson turned to his staff and ordered, "Bring the car over here. Go to headquarters immediately. General William will be overjoyed." 3 hours later, Charles received an updated reply from Colonel Johnson, "I've contacted my superiors, and the military welcomes your factory in our country. We've secured a series of preferential policies for you, including subsidies for purchasing real estate, priority hiring of workers, and legal assistance from the military." The most attractive of these was the military legal assistance, signifying military support and a military background. They would provide professional lawyers to safeguard Charles's factory. However, Charles was still unsatisfied. He telegraphed back, "I still have concerns. You know, the United States isn't under war pressure, which means your procurement volume won't be large." Charles knew how to bargain. This time it took a little longer, until the next day when he received a reply. Charles later learned that the military had negotiated overnight with the IRS to secure benefits for Charles. "We can grant your company a 3-year tax exemption. Furthermore, we guarantee a minimum purchase quantity for every piece of equipment your company produces. The specific quantity will be discussed in detail. Rest assured, General, we won't let you go bankrupt." From the telegram, Colonel Johnson seemed even more anxious than Charles. Charles had already anticipated this outcome. Although the United States, deeply influenced by the Monroe Doctrine, maintained a neutral stance behind closed doors, it has never been a nation unwilling to lag behind. At this time, the United States boasted the world's leading industrial production capacity, even surpassing that of Britain, which claimed to be the world's #1 power. However, its technology and military equipment lagged far behind European countries. Note, this was largely due to its non-participation in the war. Equipment and tactics rapidly evolved during combat, while the United States stagnated in peacetime. The United States attempted to catch up with the world, which is why it had previously purchased a production license for the Shire A1 from the Shire. However, as the war intensified, advanced equipment emerged one after another: grenades, mortars, light machine guns, fighter jets. Even the wealthy United States couldn't afford to buy the production licenses for all of these. Now, the Shire was actually setting up a factory in the United States. My God, this was simply a gift from God. Workers would acquire technology during production, and the company would also cultivate a large number of skilled personnel with production capabilities for the United States. In addition, there was equipment, concepts, and even tactics. Note, military equipment differs from other commodities. When it's supplied to the military, it often comes with a condition of training soldiers to use it, thus inevitably leading to tactical proliferation. Even if the U.S. were to shamelessly confiscate all these factories one day, Shire wouldn't be able to do anything about it. So, this is clearly a lamb delivered to their doorstep. Why wouldn't they welcome it? What the U.S. military doesn't know is that Shire isn't a lamb at all. He's there to fleece them. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 574 War Profits. In the small town of Lavas, a light rain fell on the tractor factory, the sounds of steel clanging and hammering echoing throughout. Before Joseph's departure, Charles visited his office. Joseph's office was simple, containing only a desk and a sofa for guests, with a pot of French daisies in the corner, Joseph's favorite. Seeing Charles appear at the door, Joseph was overjoyed, immediately putting down the documents in his hand and warmly shaking Charles's hand. "Long time no see, young Master Charles," Joseph habitually addressed Charles, but seeing Charles's military uniform, he felt a little awkward. "Should I call you General?" he asked. "It's all right, Joseph," Charles replied. "We're on the same side, no need for formalities." "It's my honor, young Master Charles," Joseph readily agreed. He knew he shouldn't be too reserved at this moment, otherwise it would be denying what young Master Charles meant by "one of us." Sitting down on the sofa, a sense of guilt welled up in Charles's heart. When the Charles family was being bullied by Francis, Joseph had been secretly helping them, especially showing great care for Charles. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say he treated Charles like a child. However, Charles hadn't visited him for almost a year, not even when he was home or working at the tractor factory. Joseph didn't think Charles had done anything wrong. Young Master Charles was busy saving France, rarely even returning home, working even on holidays. But even so, he still saved Matthew and helped him grow into a useful and confident person. Joseph was gratified. He felt only gratitude towards Charles, a heartfelt gratitude. Have you thought about how to develop your career in America? Charles took the coffee Joseph offered. Joseph hesitated for a moment. I think we should start with hand grenades. They're not difficult to produce, inexpensive, suitable for mass production, and easier to establish a foothold. Every beginning is difficult. Joseph planned to choose an easy start. But Charles rejected his idea. No, Joseph, you should expand the military production as soon as possible. Not just grenades, but also mortars, submachine guns, rifles, even helmets. Helmets? Joseph looked at Charles in confusion. The American Army doesn't wear helmets, young master. He had learned this last night after doing some preliminary research on the American arms market. Besides, helmets are also related to aesthetics. First, you have to consider whether Americans would be willing to use them, which usually requires negotiation before a decision is made. But Charles insisted on his idea. You just focus on production. You don't need to consider anything else. The Americans would definitely use them, Charles was certain. Because at that time, the Americans were indiscriminate in their needs. They would wear anything, even an iron pot, let alone a helmet. Yes, young master, Joseph nodded in agreement. Young Master Charles must have his reasons. If all else fails, these helmets could be shipped from America to France and sold for a good price. These things are never hard to sell during wartime. Charles added, you probably have about $100 million in funding. Joseph, who had just sat down on the sofa, looked at Charles in shock. Young Master Charles was certain that the American military industry could make money and had bet everything on it. Isn't this too risky? Joseph hesitated. No, Joseph, Charles replied. Do as I say. What you need to consider is how to use the funds to expand production capacity and produce as many qualified products as possible in the shortest amount of time. As you wish, young Master Charles. Joseph sat up straight, as if this was beyond his capacity to handle. I will do as you say. Joseph guessed that young Master Charles was a general, and he must know the direction of the war, which was why he chose this seemingly risky and radical approach, which was actually a way to seize business opportunities. Charles then instructed, but the produced equipment must not be known to the Americans, especially the American military, while it is stored in the warehouse. Joseph understood this. This was a common tactic used by capitalists, commonly known as hunger marketing, artificially creating the illusion of scarcity to raise prices, and then suddenly dumping the goods at high prices to achieve huge profits. What Joseph didn't know was that things were far more complicated than he thought. Shire's logic was clear. At this point, even the Americans themselves believed they wouldn't get involved in a war that had nothing to do with them, so the U.S. military would only make small batch purchases. Just as Colonel Johnson had said, they would give Shire a minimum purchase quantity to ensure Shire's arsenal wouldn't go bankrupt. This seemed like giving Shire many preferential policies, but in reality, it was keeping Shire's arsenal in a state of limbo until the Americans learned all the technology and trained a large number of workers and technicians. But what they didn't expect was that Shire was precisely exploiting this mentality. When discussing the minimum purchase quantity, Charles could use this to inflate prices. What? Only 1,000 rifles? That's too small. These are rifles. There are hundreds of thousands of them on the European battlefield, and they're in high demand. 10,000 won't do either. That's not even a fraction of the European market. The profit wouldn't even cover the machinery and factory construction. 15,000. Okay, but at double the price, otherwise we won't have any profit margin. The Americans calculated that this made sense, and they couldn't let Charles go bankrupt like that. So the agreement was reached amicably. Not just rifles, but all other equipment was in a similar situation. The U.S. military thought they had gotten a bargain. They had acquired the same advanced equipment as on the European battlefield at a minimal cost, along with technology, tactics, and many other things that money couldn't buy. However, one day they suddenly learned they were going to war, and the situation changed completely. We need 100,000 rifles, immediately. What? Insufficient production capacity. We'll pay more, the faster the better. As a result, large quantities of equipment were delivered to American soldiers at prices several times higher than normal. And it was definitely not just 100,000. The image above shows the U.S. military in 1917. In 1917, the U.S. military had only 130,000 men, but after deciding to enter the war, it rapidly expanded to 4 million within a year, with more than 2 million troops deployed to the Western Front. The image shows extremely rudimentary equipment. Afterwards, the U.S. military urgently issued hundreds of thousands of French or British helmets. Charles's development strategy was designed specifically for this period when the U.S. military's rapid expansion led to severe shortages of various equipment. At that time, not only rifles, grenades, and bullets, but also the prices of fabric for producing uniforms, as well as canteens and medicine, would skyrocket. The Americans wanted to fleece Charles, but they never expected to be fleeced themselves. Chapter 575 Enclosed Cockpit. Taking advantage of his holiday, Charles visited the aircraft manufacturing plant. He wasn't there to see Uncle Eric. Charles had heard that the alcoholic had become henpecked since quitting drinking, spending every day after work with his wife and children, keeping himself incredibly busy. Charles decided against joining in the fun. Instead, he went to the Research and Development Department, where aero engine talent recruited from Britain was gathered. The department resembled a factory, but even more so a warehouse, filled with equipment, machinery, and workers. The workers were engrossed in their work, using various tools to manipulate machinery Charles couldn't understand. Disassembling, cutting, welding, they were busy as bees, and Charles didn't even notice them as he walked past. Note: true welding appeared in 1881 as carbon arc welding. Electroslag welding appeared by 1915, but most still used the manual arc welding invented in Sweden in 1910. Later, Charles realized his mistake. Those workers weren't actually workers, but rather the technical staff of the Research and Development Department. Charles stood in the middle and asked, "Sir, where's the R&D department?" The worker beside him, diligently tightening a screw with a wrench, replied without looking up, "This is it." Charles was taken aback, looking around. He had imagined the R&D department to be filled with blueprints, desks, and data flying everywhere, with charming secretaries serving tea and water. He hadn't expected it to be like this. Then, Charles hesitated. "Where's Dorn?" The worker gestured with his chin towards the engine and shouted, "Boss, someone's looking for you." The engine was mounted on the control panel, and someone was fiddling with it below. After hearing the shout, he waited a while before stretching out from his skateboard. Covered in oil, he wiped his hands with a cloth and casually asked, "Who is it?" Turning around and looking at Charles in his military uniform, he froze. Then he suddenly laughed. "Damn it, it's Corsican boy, and you didn't even notice." The other workers finally realized what was happening, stopping what they were doing and turning their attention to Charles. A cheer erupted, along with the sound of wrenches falling to the ground. As they surrounded him, many had notebooks and pens in hand. "I'm your fan, General. Give me your autograph. Give me one too." Charles fulfilled their requests one by one. Those who didn't have notebooks had Charles sign their clothes. "Everything is going very well, boss." Dorn nodded toward the engine. "It has already broken through 200 horsepower, and we believe there is still room for improvement." Note: aero engines are different from tank engines. The former requires strict control over size and weight, while the latter has much more leeway in these aspects. This is why tank engines can reach 250 horsepower while aero engines are still at 200 horsepower. "Very good," Charles expressed his approval. The Germans installed their most advanced aero engines on airships to bomb Britain in 1918, and those engines were only 200 horsepower. In other words, Charles's Research and Development Department was at least 2 years ahead of Germany in terms of aero engine technology. "Boss," Dorn said, taking a sip of water, half-jokingly, "you're not worried about losing us, so you're visiting us during this rare holiday, are you?" The researchers burst into laughter, chattering amongst themselves. "Don't worry, boss, we read the newspapers every day and know about every victory you've won. Those victories are partly ours. It's one of our motivations. Yes, we still firmly hold air superiority. We're truly amazing." Talented people are often outspoken. They don't understand the societal norm of humility and restraint, saying whatever comes to mind. Charles frankly acknowledged their contributions. "You're right, gentlemen. Air superiority is one of the reasons I've achieved victory. It's indispensable. Your efforts almost determine the outcome of a battle." Charles was telling the truth. Recently, fighter jet deployments had been low, But that was because German aircraft couldn't match the French camel fighters and had adopted a hide your strength and bide your time strategy. The French army thus gained more comprehensive and timely intelligence, and could also freely attack the German supply lines. The researchers beamed with pride, seemingly enjoying Charles's praise. But it's not because I'm worried about losing you all, Charles imitated their boasting, because I'm the wisest boss, able to provide you with the most suitable environment and the best development opportunities. Only a fool would leave, right? The researchers burst into laughter. This boss seemed quite sociable. Charles's smile faded slightly. I'm here because I have an idea, and I'd like to hear your opinions. What is it? Dorn moved a work chair and sat down in front of Charles, asking with interest, is it about the engine? No, Charles shook his head. We all know that to make an airplane fly faster, besides increasing engine horsepower, another method is to reduce the drag coefficient. Everyone nodded in agreement, a hint of surprise in their eyes. The Corsican boy was good, he knew about the drag coefficient. Dorn interjected, that's why we put fairings on the machine guns of the camel fighter, General. This was the origin of the nickname camel. The two machine guns on the nose used fairings to make them resemble the humps of a camel. I know, Charles nodded. So I was thinking, since we can put fairings on the machine guns, why not do the same for the fuselage, fleet, fairings? The researchers were all stunned. Soon they exclaimed in surprise, yes, that's a brilliant idea. An open cockpit increases wind resistance significantly, especially during climbs and dives. Adding a fairing would undoubtedly solve this problem, and it would also greatly improve pilot comfort. At least they wouldn't be exposed to the wind and rain. But how can pilots fight with a fairing? We can use transparent glass for the fairing, Bruce. Dorn looked at Charles and slowly nodded, a very good idea, boss. I'm thinking of a possibility. Could you stay here and become one of us instead of going to the battlefield? The researchers laughed again. They all knew it was impossible. If Charles were willing to do that, the French would demolish the research institute the next day. But Charles, he certainly deserved to stay, because his suggestion alone surpassed many others. See, Charles spread his hands, threatening in a cheeky tone, does anyone else want to leave? The researchers burst into laughter. No, boss, we'd be happy to serve you. I won't leave, but give us a raise. Charles's face darkened, he hadn't heard that. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.